Okay, had a little technical difficulty. Let's give it a second for some more people to come back in. Do a little mulligan. Um, anyway, as I was saying, let's see, put this up in other places. As I was saying, before I knocked the power out of my device, we're going to continue working on what we were working on yesterday, which is A.G. Sertillanges' The Intellectual Life, Its Spirit, Conditions, and Methods. And we'll have discussion interspersed, provided that the live chat is active enough. We'll go ahead and do prayer. We'll do it in Latin today. Oremus. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritui Sancti, Creator ineffabilis, qui decessare sapientiae Tue, tres angelorem archias designasti, et ea super celum imperium mirror in colocasti, atque universae partes elegantissime disposuisti, twinquam qui, verus fons, luminans et sapientiae diceris, atque supermeniens principium, infundere digneris, super intellectus mei tenebras Tue radium claritatis, duplices in quibus nato summa me removens tenebras, peccatum scilicet et ignoratiam. Tu, qui linguas infantium facies desertas, linguam meam erurias atque in labis meis gratium, Tue benedictione infundas. Da mihi, intelligende acumen, retenende capacitatem, adiscende modum et facilitatem, interpretandi subtilitatem, loquendi gratium copiosum, ingressum instruos progressum dirigas egressum compleas, tu qui es veros Deus et homo, qui vivas et regnas in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Okay. If you check the comments, if you check the description of the video, I've got a link to an archive.org version of the book that you can go through for free if you want to use one of their accounts, but their accounts are free. It lets you so-called borrow it for an hour, and you can do that. There's also plenty of places, including archive.org itself, where you can get the book as a PDF. I'm not going to tell people where to go to pirate books. It's not that hard to find, but this one is very available if you want to get it that way. It's also, I've got links on Amazon there so that you can get it on Amazon and pay for it like a good boy. The chapters we're going to be going through today are in the description. I'll just give you their names. I won't go into the sub chapters, but you may want to read through those so you can know what we're going to be working on. But today we're going to be working on Chapter 1, which is the intellectual vocation, Chapter 2, virtues of a Catholic intellectual, and Chapter 3, the organization of life. Now, I'm going to pause at the end of each section and check for questions. If you have questions as we're going through the book, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll go ahead and look at them and, try to give you some answers, or we can have something to talk about. Please feel free to do that. It makes this a better experience. And if you don't, and I look and there aren't any, then, I'll give any remarks I might have, if I have any, and then we'll move forward. Chapter 1, the intellectual vocation. with the subheadings, the intellectual has a sacred call. Section 2, the intellectual does not stand alone. And Section 3, the intellectual belongs to his time. Section 1. When we speak of vocation, we refer to those who intend to make intellectual work their life, whether they are entirely free to give themselves up to study, or whether, though engaged in some calling, they hold happily in reserve a supplement of their activity and, as a reward, the development and deepening of their mind. I say the deepening in order to set aside the idea of a superficial tincture of knowledge. A vocation is not fulfilled by vague reading and a few scattered writings. It requires penetration and continuity and methodical effort, so as to attain a fullness of development which will correspond to the call of the Spirit and to the resources that it has pleased him to bestow on us. This call is not to be taken for granted. To start precipitately on a road which one could not tread with a firm step would be merely to prepare the way for disillusionment. Everyone has the duty to work, and after a first early and toilsome training, no one acts wisely if he lets his mind fall gradually back into its primitive ignorance. But the effortless maintenance of what one has acquired is one thing, and it is quite another to consolidate from the foundations upwards a sum of knowledge recognized as merely provisional, seen to be simply and solely a starting point. This second state of mind is that of one who has the vocation. It implies a serious resolution. The life of study is austere and imposes grave obligations. It pays richly, but it exacts an initial outlay that few are capable of. The athletes of the mind, like those of the playing field, must be prepared for privations, long training, a sometimes superhuman tenacity. We must give ourselves from the heart, if truth is to give itself to us. Truth serves only its slaves. This way of life must not be entered on without long self-examination. The intellectual vocation is like every other, that is, it is written in our instincts, in our powers, in a sort of inner impulse of which reason must judge. Our dispositions are like the chemical properties which determine for every body the combinations into which that body can enter. A vocation is something that cannot be had for the asking. It comes from heaven and from our first nature. The whole point is to be docile to God and to oneself as soon as they have spoken. Understood in this sense, Disraeli's saying that you may do what you please provided it really pleases you contains a great meaning. Our liking, if correlated to our fundamental tendencies and to our aptitudes, is an excellent judge. If St. Thomas could say that pleasure characterizes functions and may serve to classify men, he must be led to conclude that pleasure can also reveal our vocation. Only we must search down the depths where liking and the spontaneous impulse are linked up with the gifts of God and his providence. Besides the immense interest of realizing oneself to one's fullness, the investigation into an intellectual vocation has a more general interest which no one may disregard. Christianized humanity is made up of various personalities, no one of which can refuse to function without impoverishing the group and without depriving the eternal Christ of a part of his kingdom. Christ reigns by unfolding himself in men. Every life of one of his members is a characteristic moment of his duration. Every individual man and Christian is an instance, incommunicable, unique, and therefore necessary, of the extension of the so-called spiritual body. If you are designated as a light bearer, do not go and hide under a bushel the gleam or the flame expected from you in the house of the Father of all. Love truth and its fruits of life, for yourself and for others. Devote to study and to the profitable use of study the best part of your time and your heart. All roads but one are bad roads for you, since they diverge from the direction in which your action is expected and required. Do not prove faithless to God, to your brethren, and to yourself by rejecting a sacred call. That presupposes you come to the intellectual life with unselfish motives, not through ambition or foolish vanity. The jingling bells of publicity tempt only frivolous minds. Ambition offends eternal truth by subordinating truth to itself. It is not a sacrilege to play with the questions that dominate life and death, with mysterious nature, with God, to achieve some literary or philosophical celebrity, expense of the true. Excuse that whole sentence. Is it not a sacrilege to play with the questions that dominate life and death, with mysterious nature, with God, to achieve some literary or philosophical celebrity at the expense of the true and independent of the true? Such aims, and especially the first mentioned, would not sustain the seeker. His effort would speedily be seen to slacken, his vanity to fall back on some empty satisfaction, with no care for the reality of things. But it presupposes also that to the acceptance of the end, you add the acceptance of the means. Otherwise, there would be no real obedience to your vocation. Many people would like to possess a knowledge. A vague aspiration turns the eyes of the multitude towards horizons that the greater number admire from afar off, as the victim of gout or asthma look upon the eternal snows. To get something without paying for it is the universal desire, but it is the desire of cowardly hearts and weak brains. The universe does not respond to the first murmured request, and the light of God does not shine upon your study lamp unless your soul asks for it with persistent effort. You are consecrated by your vocation. Will what truth wills, content for the sake of truth to bestir yourself, to take up your abode within its proper realm, to organize your life, and, realizing your inexperience, to learn from the experience of others. If youth but knew, the young above all need this warning. Science is the broad meaning of the word scientia, is knowledge through causes, but actively, as to its attainment, it is the creation by causes. We must recognize and adopt the causes of knowledge, then provide them, and not defer attention to the foundations of our building until the moment of putting up the roof. On the first free years after early study, when the ground of our intelligence has been newly turned up, and the seed sown, what splendid tillage could be undertaken. That is the time that will never come again, the time that we shall have to live on by and by. What it is, we shall be, for we can hardly put down new roots. The future is always the heir of the past. The penalty for neglecting at the right time to prepare is to live on the surface of things. Let each one think of that, while thinking may be of some avail. How many young people, with the pretension to become workers, miserly waste their days, their strength, their vigor of their intelligence, their ideal? Either they do not work, there is time enough, or they work badly, capriciously, without knowing what they are, nor where they want to go, nor how to get there. Lectures, reading, choice of companions, the proper proportion of work and rest, of solitude and activity, of general culture and specialization, the spirit of study, the art of picking out and utilizing data gained, some provisional output which will give an idea of what the future work is to be, the virtues to be acquired and developed. Nothing of all that is thought out, and no satisfactory fulfillment will follow. What a difference, supposing equal resources, between the man who understands and looks ahead, and the man who proceeds at haphazard. Genius is long patience, but it must be organized and intelligent patience. One does not need extraordinary gifts to carry some work through. Average superiority suffices. The rest depends on energy and wise application of energy. It is as with a conscientious workman, careful and steady at his task. That is, he gets somewhere, while an inventive genius is often merely an embittered failure. What I have just said is true of everyone, but I apply it especially to those who know that they have at their disposal only a part of their life, the least part, in which to give themselves to the labors of the mind. They, more than others, must be men consecrated by their vocation. What they cannot spread out over all their years, they must concentrate in a small space. The special asceticism and heroic virtue of the intellectual worker must be their daily portion. But if they consent to this double self-offering, I tell them in the name of God and the God of truth, not to lose courage. If genius is not necessary for production, still less is it necessary to have entire liberty. What is more, liberty presents pitfalls that rigorous obligations may help us to avoid. A stream, narrowly hemmed in by its banks, will flow more impetuously. The discipline of some occupation is an excellent school. It bears fruit in the hours of studious leisure. The very constraint will make you concentrate better. You will learn the value of time. You will take eager refuge in those rare hours during which, the claims of duty satisfied, you could turn to your ideal and enjoy the relaxation of some chosen activity after the labor imposed by the hard necessity of getting a livelihood. The worker who thus finds, in a fresh effort, the reward of previous effort, who prizes it as a miser prizes his hoard, is usually passionately devoted to his ideal. He cannot be turned aside from a purpose thus consecrated by sacrifice. If his progress seems slower, he is capable of getting farther. Like the poor drudging tortoise, he does not dawdle, he persists, and in a few years' time he will have outstripped the indolent hare, whose agile movements were the envy of his own lumbering gait. The same is true of the isolated worker, deprived of intellectual resources and stimulating society, buried in some little provincial spot where he seems condemned to stagnate, exiled far from rich libraries, brilliant leisure, an eagerly responsive public, possessing only himself and obliged to draw solely on that inalienable capital. He must not lose courage either. Though he have everything against him, let him but keep possession of himself and be content with that. An ardent heart has more chance of achieving something than a crammed head abusing the opportunities of great cities. Here, again, strength may spring from difficulty. It is in the steep mountain passes that one bends and strains. Level paths allow one to relax, and a state of uncontrolled relaxation quickly becomes fatal. The most valuable thing of all is will, a deeply rooted will to be somebody, to achieve something, to be even now and desire that somebody, recognizable by his ideal. Everything else always settles itself. There are books everywhere, and only a few are necessary. Society, stimulation, one finds there in spirit one solitude. The great are there, present to those who call on them, and the great ages behind impel the ardent thinker forward. As to lectures, those who can have them do not follow them, or follow them but ill, if they do not in themselves at need the wherewithal to do without such fortunate help. As to the public, if it sometimes stimulates, it often disturbs, scatters the mind, and by going to pick up 2 pennies in the street you may lose a fortune. Unimpassioned solitude is better, for there every seed produces 100-fold, and every ray of sunlight suffuses the whole landscape with autumnal gold. St. Thomas of Aquin, as he was coming to settle in Paris, and described the great city in the distance, said to the brother who was with him thus, "Brother, I would give all that for the commentary of Chrysostom on St. Matthew." When one feels like that, it does not matter where one is, nor what resources one has. One is stamped with the seal. One is of the elect of the Spirit. One has only to preserve and to trust life as it is ruled for us by God. You young men who understand this language, and to whom the heroes of the mind seem mysteriously to beckon, but who fear to lack the necessary means, listen to me. Have you 2 hours a day? Can you undertake to keep them jealously, to use them ardently, and then, being of those who have authority in the kingdom of God, can you drink the chalice of which these pages would wish to make you savor the exquisite and bitter taste? If so, have confidence, nay, rest and quiet certainty. If you are compelled to earn your living, at least you will earn it without sacrificing, as so many do, the liberty of your soul. If you are alone, you will be but more violently thrown back to your noble purposes. Most great men follow some calling. Many have declared that the 2 hours I postulate suffice for an intellectual career. Learn to make the best use of that limited time. Plunge every day of your life into the spring which quenches and yet ever renews your thirst? Do you want to have a humble share in perpetuating wisdom among men, in gathering up the inheritance of the ages, in formulating the rules of the mind for the present time, in discovering facts and causes, in turning men's wandering eyes towards first causes and their hearts towards supreme ends, in reviving, if necessary, some dying flame, in organizing the propaganda of truth and goodness? That is the lot reserved to you. It is surely worth a little extra sacrifice. It is worth steadily pursuing with jealous passion. The study and practice of what Pierre Gautret calls living logic, that is, the development of our mind, the human word, by contact with direct or indirect with the Spirit and the divine word, that serious study and preserving practice will give you entry into the wondrous sanctuary. You will be of those who grow, who enrich themselves, and who make ready to receive magnificent gifts. You too, one day, if God so wills, will have a place in the assembly of noble minds. Okay, that's the end on the section. The section was entitled "The Intellectual Has a Sacred Call." So, the core thing to gather here is about the seriousness of time you have to put into actually learning things in a serious way. So, like actually learning things, like actually being able to operate with your mind on serious matters requires devoted and consistent attention. It's not going to be sufficient to just pick things up passively and then put them back out there. That's not what learning is about, really. What learning is really about is about picking things up and working on them like a man might work on a stone, and shape them into something which can be communicated to others and which you yourself can understand as something worked on. And most people don't understand this. And they don't understand it for a lot of different reasons, mainly because it's painful work, but also because one's discouraged from doing this. But it's the only way forward. And I don't just mean this for, academic work. I mean, if you want to be in the faith, you need to study the Bible, and Scripture is not trivial. It's not trivially difficult. It's not something you just pick up and spit back out. You need to be studying the teaching of the church. You need to be attending yourself to the fathers. And these are things that you really need to pick up and work on and shape up for yourself, so that you can understand them yourself, and shape up for others so you can teach them to your children, or so that you can communicate them to others in a teaching capacity, or so that you might be able to actually evangelize in a way that's effective. None of these things are possible without real knowledge, and real knowledge is not possible without real work. Period. There's no other way to do it. I'm looking at the chat and I don't see any questions. So I'm going to go on to section 2 unless I see something. Section 2 is entitled, "The Intellectual Does Not Stand Alone." It is another characteristic of the intellectual vocation that the Christian worker who is concentrated by his call must not be an isolated unit. Whatever be his position, however alone or hidden we suppose him to be materially, he must not yield to the lure of individualism, which is a distorted image of Christian personality. As life-giving as is solitude, so paralyzing and sterilizing is isolation. By being only a soul, one ceases to be a man, Victor Hugo would say. Isolation is inhuman, for to work in human fashion is to work with the feeling for man, his needs, his greatness, and the solidarity which binds us closely together in a common life. A Christian worker should live constantly in the universal, in history. Since he lives with Jesus Christ, he cannot separate times nor men from him. Real life is a life in common, an immense family life with charity for its law. If study is to be an act of life, not an art pursued for art's sake and an appropriation of mere abstractions, he must submit to be governed by this law of oneness of heart. We pray before the crucifix, says Gratry. We must also work before the crucifix. But the true cross is not isolated from the earth. A true Christian will have ever before his eyes the image of this globe, on which the cross is planted, on which needy men wander and suffer, all over which the redeeming blood, the numberless streams, flow to meet them. The light that he has confers on him personhood. The light that he seeks to acquire supposes an implicit promise that he will share it. Every truth is practical. The most apparently abstract, the loftiest, is also the most practical. Every truth is life, direction, a way leading to the end of man. And therefore Jesus Christ made this unique assertion thus: I am the way, the truth, and the life. Work always then with the idea of some utilization, as the gospel speaks. Listen to the murmur of the human race all about you. Pick out certain individuals of certain groups whose need you know. Find out what may bring them out of their night and ennoble them, what in any measure may save them. The only holy truths are redeeming truths, and it was not in view of our work, as of everything else, that the apostle said thus: this is the will of God, your sanctification. Christ Jesus needs our minds for his work. As on earth, he needed his own human mind. He has gone, but we continue him. We have the measureless honor. We are his members, therefore have a share in his spirit, are therefore his cooperators. He acts outwardly through us and inwardly through the inspirations of his spirit, as in his lifetime he acted outwardly by voice, inwardly by his grace. Our work being a necessary part of that action, let us work as Jesus meditated, as he drew on the life springs of the Father to pour them out on the world. All right. That's the end on the section. It looks like we did get a question. Let's see what that was. Do I recommend reading the Bible chronologically, or am I indifferent? So the church in the lectionary has typically recommended reading either in line. I mean, she's never really recommended chronological reading, although the present lectionary has a little bit of that. And she's typically recommended topical reading, especially topical by way of, it's not archetype, but by way of types. So she's usually recommended, and this is in all of the liturgical forms that I'm aware of, she usually has two readings juxtaposed. And if it's an Old Testament reading, it's usually combined with a New Testament type. So it'll be a type of the gospel and read side by side. Or sometimes thematically, the Old Testament will be put next to the New Testament. Or the reading, and this is how you often get, in the Latin lectionary, the reading will be an epistle and a gospel, and they'll be sort of mutually communicating one with the other. And then regular reading of the Psalms. So I don't know how you would call my recommendation. I think my recommendation would be a spiritual reading of the Bible. But that said, I also sort of say, look, you need to know the whole Bible. Not, memorized, but I mean, you need to have gone through the whole Bible at least once. I went through the whole Bible in middle school because nobody would yell at you at a Christian school for reading the Bible instead of paying attention. I read the whole thing. I'm going to do it again with you all here soon over the course of a year. And it's good for you. And you need to do it. And if chronologically it'll get you through it, do that. I don't necessarily recommend that because I know what's going to happen. You're going to get stuck. About Numbers of Deuteronomy is going to come along, or Chronicles is going to come along, and you're going to start grinding down on those genealogies, and it's very hard. It's very front loaded too, and so you might want to sort of check out different Catholic Bible reading plans. But if you can get through that front loading, it's not too bad. And most of the New Testament is pretty good. You won't have a problem with the New Testament. One method that's pretty easy is sort of just, back and forth New and Old Testament, and you don't really even need a plan for that. So you just, you could read a chapter in the Old Testament, read a chapter in the New Testament, and you go chronologically, as it were, that way. That's one way to do it. And that might keep you sort of in it. But I recommend, you need to, really ideally, you need to read the Psalms over and over. I recommend everybody get to the point where they memorize them. And the easiest way to do that is to go through them weekly on a cycle. That's what I've been doing in monastic lauds, is becoming familiar with them on a cycle. And certainly key psalms, the Laudato Psalms, that's 48, 49, and 50. Miserere mei, I think that's Psalm 50 on the old numbering. I think it's 51 on the new numbering. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy great mercy. Psalm 1, Psalm 2, it used to be Psalm 66. I don't remember what it is now. 67 maybe, I forget. But all the penitential psalms should be known and used as models for prayer. But that's the real reason. The real reason you need to memorize the psalms, and really in English. And Latin's good too for certain reasons. And if you understand the Latin, it doesn't matter. But if you don't understand Latin or don't understand it very well, you need it in English first. And you need to memorize it. Why do you need to memorize it? Because you memorize the Psalms so that you can pray well. Because they will teach you how to pray well. They are the models of prayer. And they were the models of prayer for Christ and the apostles. And so because that task is so important, we're not just doing a book study. I would recommend that whatever you do, you're going over the Psalms over and over again, whatever biblical reading method you're using. And really, you ought to get out of it, at the end of a year or two with at least partial memorization. Certainly of key Psalms, and that's important. Let's see. Somebody says, St. Bede said to start with the Psalms as they contain most of the major themes of the entire Old Testament. Yeah, Bede has in mind, so this is really interesting, and it doesn't make so much sense to us, but before the printing press, it made sense. So what they would do, and you can really do this with anything, although the Psalms are a good choice, is you would memorize the Psalms. That's usually the first thing you would memorize, and I mean, if you're chanting them every day, you're going to memorize most of them, or at least the core ones. But you memorize the Psalms, and then you kind of use them as a oral index to the rest of the Bible. So as you're reading the Bible, and I was trying to talk a little bit about this yesterday, it's about intentional memory and intentional learning. But as you read the rest of the Bible, when you're thinking about the Bible, you start to hook it up to the Psalms, which you've memorized. And then that helps you to organize your knowledge around the Bible. This doesn't feel like it doesn't sound like it should work, but as you get used to doing this, it becomes more intuitive. So you'll have a sort of core thing intellectually that you've really worked on and that's really clear to you, and then you just start hooking stuff onto to this core thing that you built up. And for the Bible, yeah, like using the Psalms as kind of the index for memory and for learning is a good way to do that. And so, again, the procedure for that would be do your best to memorize or learn the Psalms really well. And that's not trivial. That's like a 6 month to that's like a 6 month to 2 year process. So don't think, oh, I got to get it done in a day. And once you know them really well, as you're reading the Bible, start hooking up. Like when you're reading, go, oh, that's like Psalm 50, where he says, and then you start hooking them up, and then you kind of have a topical index in your mind of sort of how everything's related. It helps you to make a map of the Bible. It's a big deal. And it'll really help you actually be insightful about Scripture spiritually. This way of doing things is not the academic way, but it's spiritually superior to anything you get out of academia. I don't recommend touching an academic commentary on the Bible until you've got your spiritual life sorted out in some way, because academic approaches to learning the Bible and understanding the Bible are basically useless, at least for a beginner. They can be helpful for other things, but they're not useful for the spiritual life very much at all, in the beginning anyway. Okay. Now we'll go on to section 3. Oh, let me see. Was there anything I wanted to say about this section? Yeah, so, okay. Father and I were talking about this in study this morning. So, if you're going to be doing intellectual work, you need to be, of course, everything you're doing, none of this is for you. Per se. Nothing you do in the intellectual life is just for you. It's either you in relation to God and you in relation to, getting closer and more fully in union with God, or you in relation to others in sort of a living re-presencing of Christ's ministry. So in practical terms, you need to be constantly working either to get closer to God and your knowledge of God and improvement in your spiritual life in a sort of me and God way, in the way that, prayer is often a me and God thing where you're talking directly to God. Or you need to be getting, more and more focused on helping others, both materially and spiritually, with your knowledge. You should not just be piling up knowledge for vain purposes, just for puzzle solving or curiosity or wasting time, or because people are interested in this or that. This is not like science videos on YouTube. This is not the point of anything. It's either it's for salvation, it's for unity, it's for the unity of others with God, it's for loving God, it's for you loving God, it's for helping others to love God, it's for bringing the gifts of God to others. That's what this is for. It has no other purpose. Which is not to say that this isn't a narrow spiritual utilitarian kind of thing. I mean, we're going to be reading Platonic dialogues, and we're going to be getting into sort of theological mysteries and all sorts of difficult things. And these might be very obscure. So it doesn't mean that, you need to throw out anything that's not immediately useful. This isn't like, how's this going to help the poor? We don't need to do this. That's not what we're doing. But everything you're doing needs to be done outside of yourself, not merely about vain interests. It has to be for others in some way. Let's see, we got some questions. what happens if a Protestant prays a rosary from the Catholic perspective? What do you mean? What happens? Our Lady doesn't get angry at him, I suppose. It's good for him. There's nothing wrong with it. It might help him to come into unity with the church. There's nothing wrong with a Protestant praying the rosary. So I don't know what you mean. What happens? We could ask what happens. Is he? First of all, we have to ask whether or not the Protestant's in a state of grace. He might be. Some Protestants are in a state of grace. And so it might even be meritorious for him. We can't know the state of his soul or whether or not such prayers operate through grace. But if he isn't, so we're in the question of what does God answer the prayers of sinners, and not for their own sake, but he sometimes finds it salutary to answer their prayers for the sake of their conversion or for the sake of others. So it might even be efficacious in other ways. Somebody asks, I can only stay for a minute, but thank you for this. It might be useful for non-live viewers to have some general timestamps, break up the 2 to 3 hour video into smaller chunks. I'll try to do that. I'm not very good at organizing stuff. If a commenter later wants to come on here and break it into chunks for me, I'll pin that comment. But I've never been a good secretarial guy. I'm not at all good at that. This is key. It's way too easy to do it for selfish reasons. Yeah, no, it's really important. So like most guys who do intellectual work, especially on the internet, are vague. Are vain. They're caught up in and I'll admit I've been caught up in vanity before intellectually. Usually personal. I'm more introverted in my vanity than extroverted, but lots of people get into intellectual things to show off, or to satisfy some kind of sort of merely personal curiosity or interest or obsession. And these aren't. This isn't right. You need to organize yourself. If you have any kind of intellectual ability, God's given it to you. And if you're a Catholic, you should avail yourself of the full teaching of the Church to know the various uses that you might put this gift that God has given you to. You should at the very least be thinking about how this might help to educate others and to bring them closer to God, either those who don't know him at all in a sort of missionary way, or the faithful who are confused. If your primary thing you're doing with your intellectual life is polemics, that's probably vain. No, not always, but a lot of the time. There's a lot of the time. It's just vanity. It's somebody said this, I got to get them and show how much. No, that's vanity most of the time. And, you need to be aware of that. Like all of the social sins have intellectual equivalents. And you need to know if, you've fallen into that and you need to avoid it. And then you need to go out on the positive mission of the church, in light of all the virtues and be operating intellectually in a virtuous way, directed towards others, ministering towards others. That's the point of the faith. If you didn't get it by now, you're supposed to get it by now. Let's see. Somebody says, Vrox says, I thought about the rosary thing. I thought it might be like Protestant take communion, Eucharist. It's inappropriate. No, it's not inappropriate. Absolutely not. Well, we could. Is it? So there's levels of inappropriate. So is it objectively inappropriate? No, I mean it's good. A Protestant who's separated from the church, who doesn't have the fullness of the faith, he comes to. We don't have to talk about the rosary. He comes to Mass, and the church allows everyone to come to Mass. Everyone of goodwill can come to Mass. Protestants, atheists, it doesn't matter. Come to Mass. We want you to come to Mass. And, this person, he comes to Mass and he's not, in line with the church. He doesn't agree with, 75% of what we're saying, but he comes and he does the prayers and he kneels and stands and all of that. He doesn't, assuming he doesn't receive he shouldn't be receiving the Eucharist. But, assume he does everything right. Is there anything disordered with him being there? No, objectively speaking, no. Now, subjectively, I mean, that's better. Obviously, it's better that he be there than wherever else he would be. It's better that he come to Mass on Sunday than he go to his own church on Sunday. Obviously, even though he may agree with his own church on Sunday. Now, that said, there may be some disorder subjectively. So, there's a million reasons. Like, are you praying the rosary? You could be praying the rosary for the wrong reasons. You could be praying the rosary to show how dumb it is, or you could be praying the rosary in some sort of heretical mode, like there's an Anglican rosary, or there's ways that might not be rightly ordered, or you might be doing it in a perfunctoral way because you got forced to come, and that might not be rightly ordered. There's lots of reasons why it might not be rightly ordered on the side of him, but in terms of his alternatives, is he's doing what he's supposed to. If he's at Mass, he's doing what he's supposed to, even though he might otherwise not be doing what he's supposed to. It's the same question as to whether or not an adulterer or somebody in some other grave sin, should they be at Mass, not whether they should take the Eucharist, without confession. Should they be at Mass? Yes, they should be at Mass. Should the divorced and remarried who are in a publicly, not allowed relationship, should a Catholic who's divorced and remarried, not whether he should take the Eucharist, should he come to Mass? Yes. Yes. He should continue to come. He should continue to pray. He should continue to pray for the grace necessary to convert and change his life. That's what he should be doing. And he may pray for that explicitly, and he should pray for it explicitly, but he may only be able to pray for conversion implicitly, and God may grant it to him one day, and that's what he should be doing. It's rightly ordered, absolutely. Let's see, what else does somebody say? Oh, somebody says, don't touch the Jerome biblical commentary. The thing about biblical commentaries is that you notice right away when something's wrong. You only need to know a little church teaching, or, a little bit about, basically, if you read something on the page and then the commentary says the opposite, put the commentary down. Now, there's sometimes, if you've run into a difficulty, like there is a legitimate historical difficulty or a legitimate textual difficulty, and it's trying to work through a problem, that's one thing. But if you pick up a biblical commentary and it's out in outer space somewhere, or it's obviously got it, just put it down. Don't pick it back up. It's not worth it. Maybe, unless you're working in biblical textual scholarship as an academic, just put it back down. It won't help you. Just put it right down. If it doesn't help you to know God, if it doesn't help you to understand difficult problems in a useful way for your spiritual life, just put it down. And you can come back to it later when you're solid. Any of this controversial historical, Bart Ehrman stuff, just put that all down, put it away till you got your spiritual life straightened out. Then you can come back and play around with that for a purpose. Don't be playing around with it just to play around. It's no good for most people. Let's see. Oh yeah, somebody complimented my hair. Thank you very much for my hair. I appreciate it. Okay, let's see now. Where were we? We need to do section 3. We got 3 chapters today. You guys are like the kids with the substitute teaching. Should get me to talking. I'll only get 5% of the lesson out. Section 3 is entitled, as we said before, "The Intellectual Belongs to His Time." 3. And then reflect that if all times are equal before God, if his eternity is a radiant center from which all points on the circumference of time are at an equal distance, It is not the same with the ages and with us who dwell in the circumference. We are here at a given point on the mighty wheel, not elsewhere. If we are here, it is because God has placed us here. Every moment of duration concerns us, and every age is our neighbor as well as every man. But the word neighbor is a relative word to which the wisdom of providence attaches a precise meaning for each of us, and to which each of us, in submissive wisdom, must also attach a precise meaning. Here I am, a man of the 20th century, living in a time of permanent drama, witnessing upheavals as perhaps the globe never saw before, since the mountains rose and the seas were driven into their caverns. What have I to do for this painting? Palpitating century. More than ever before, the thought is waiting for men, and men for thought. The world is in danger for lack of life-giving maxims. We're in a train rushed ahead at top speed, no signals visible. The planet is going it knows not where. Its law has failed it. Who will give it back its sun? All this is not intended to narrow down the field of intellectual research and to confine it to exclusively religious study. That will be evident. I have already said that every truth is practical, that every truth has saving power, but I am indicating a spirit, and this spirit, both in general and because of what is opportune at the present time, excludes mere dilettantism. It also excludes a certain archaeological tendency, a love of the past which turns away from the present suffering, an esteem for the past which seems not to recognize the universal presence of God. Every age is not as good as every other, but all ages are Christian ages, and there is one which for us and in practice surpasses them all, that is our own. In view of it are our inborn resources, our graces of today and tomorrow, and consequently the efforts that we must make in order to correspond with them. Let us not be like those people who always seem to be pallbearers at the funeral of the past. Let us utilize, by living, the qualities of the dead. Truth is ever new, like the grass of morning, moist with glistening dew. All the old virtues are waiting to spring up afresh. God does not grow old. We must help our God to renew, not to be buried past in the chronicles of a vanished world, but the eternal face of the earth. Such is the spirit of the Catholic intellectual. Such is his vocation. The sooner he gives precision to this general idea by finding out what kind of study is right for him, the better. Listen now to the virtues that God asks of him. Let's see. We have some more chat. Oh, it's Belle talking about the reading the Bible. She gives good advice almost always. So just listen to whatever she says. She's very smart. On this section, so the part that's so first of all, what is he saying? He's saying that it's true that everything is all time is indifferent to God. Sort of all things are. This isn't quite right, but you might want to say all things are right now for God. There's no, the distant past and the present future is God. God isn't stuck with a sort of narrow frame of attention at the immediate moment. But we are, and wherever we are, God's put us there. And if we are to do anything, we have to be where we are. That's concomitant with the prior section. If we're going to help people, we have to help sort of with respect of now. Whatever reading we do, whatever work we do, it needs to be with an eye to now. And again, not in the narrow way, not in the stupid, this this doesn't have obvious immediate application, nobody's interested in this, so I don't need to deal with it. No. You might as well throw the whole Bible out if you're going to have that attitude. It's more, what does this have to do with the needs of people today? Which excludes antiquarianism. It's just mere interest with the vast piling up of information from the entirety of history or whatever for just to do it. That's excluded. He also says, and I thought this was very apropos, he says, let us not be like those people who always seem to be pallbearers at the funeral of the past. Let us utilize by living the qualities of the dead. Truth is ever new. So that seems to me to be the traditionalist tendency. That is to say, things, were always, more glorious just before now, and we need to just continue to talk about the greatness of the past and continue to re-say the greatness of the past just to say it. That's not what's important, or continuing to fight battles from just after the Second Vatican Council, 40, 50 years ago. As E. Michael Jones says, that's not going to help that kid stuck at his computer addicted to pornography. That is to say, that's a real problem of today is, addiction to pornography, sexual addictions, for lack of a seriousness, a frivolity of life, lack of real concern with others, a kind of misery of tedium. These things are not going to be helped by trying to backseat drive things from a long time ago that are already gone and buried. That's not our job as intellectuals, to win fights that are already over. Let's see. Okay. We'll keep going. We're on chapter 2. Now I want to get through chapter 3 today so that we can finish this week, because I got a lot of introductory material. And by the way, I didn't go over. I went over it yesterday, but I'll tell you for anybody who just got here. So what we're going to be doing this, I'm going to have to reintroduce the approach over and over again. But right now, we're doing preparatory material. Right now I'm talking to you about the intellectual life as it's to be understood in light of the spiritual life. And this is the best book for that purpose. And that's kind of your major introductory text to, coming along with me and doing the work I do on a regular basis. But after that, we're going to read a book on Lectio Divina, so that you can sort of understand how better to approach the Bible. It's a short book, but it's by a serious person who was both an abbot and an archbishop. And so I trust him to know how to read the Bible. And then after that, I'm going to read from a section in the new printing of the Catechism there, on an introduction to catechisms, to what the point of those are. Because the core project that I want to do every day is a reading from the Bible and a reading from the Catechism. And I think that was, I was looking for a good introduction to reading the lives of the saints. But as far as I can tell, nobody's ever written an introduction on that. Not that I can find. Occasional remarks. Gary Gillibrand has some remarks, but I never seen anybody actually just sit down and tell you, this is what the lives of the saints are about, and this is how you do it. But if I find one, I'll read it. But the whole point is to at least get through those 3 introductory texts so that you have foundations, so that we can go forward in the actual intellectual project I want to do every day. Okay. Chapter 2, the virtues of a Catholic intellectual, with the following 4 subsections. Subsection 1, the common virtues. Subsection 2, the virtue proper to the intellectual. Subsection 3, the spirit of prayer. Subsection 4, the discipline of the body. Section 1. I might say that virtue potentially contains I might say that virtue potentially contains intellectuality, for since it leads to our end, which is intellectual, virtue is equivalent to the supreme knowledge. One could draw many things from that, everything indeed, for this primacy of the moral order involves the relative dependence of truth, of beauty, of harmony, of unity, of being itself with regard to morality, which is thus related to the first principle of all things. But I prefer to follow a humbler path. The qualities of character have a preponderant role in everything. The intellect is only a tool. The handling of it determines the nature of its effects. Properly to regulate the intelligence it is not evident that qualities quite different from intelligence itself are required. Instinctively, every right mind declares that superiority in any branch includes a measure of spiritual superiority. To judge truly, you must be great. Would there not be something repellent in seeing a great discovery made by an unprincipled rascal? The unspoiled instinct of a simple man would be grievously hurt by it. There is something shocking in disassociation which dislocates the harmony of the human being. One has no faith in jewel merchants who sell pearls and wear none. To be in close contact with the great spring of all things without acquiring anything of its moral nature seems a paradox. To enjoy the faculty of intelligence and to make of it an isolated force, a so-called bump, is, one suspects, a dangerous game. For every isolated force in a balanced whole becomes the victim of its surroundings. If, then, character makes shipwreck, one must expect the sense of the great truths to suffer. The mind, being no longer held in check, no longer finding its level, will start down some dangerous incline, and one knows that a small error in the beginning becomes great in the end. The force of logic may send to a more precipitous fall the man whose faculty of discernment finds no safeguard in his soul. That is the cause of so many sensational lapses and of so many blunders with a spark of genius in them among masters who have lost the true direction in life. Life is a unity, that is, it would be very surprising if we could give fullest play to one of its functions while neglecting the other, or if to live our ideas should not help us to perceive them. What is the source of this unity of life? Love. Tell me what you love, I will tell you what you are. Love is the beginning of everything in us, and that starting point which is common to knowledge and practice cannot fail to make the right paths of both in a certain measure interdependent. Truth visits those who love her, who surrender to her, and this love cannot be without virtue. For this reason, in spite of his possible defects, the man of genius at work is already virtuous. It would suffice for his holiness if he were more completely his true self. The true springs up in the same soil as the good, that is, their roots communicate. Broken from the common root, and therefore less in contact with the soil, one or other suffers. The soul grows anemic, or the mind wilts. On the contrary, by feeding the mind on truth, one enlightens the conscience. By fostering good, one guides knowledge. By practicing the truth that we know, we merit the truth that we do not yet know. We merit it in the sight of God. We merit it also with a merit which brings its own reward, for all truths are linked together, and homage in act being the most decisive of all, when we pay that homage by living the truth of life, we draw near to the supreme light and to all that flows from it. If I embark on the tributary, I reach the river, and then the sea. Let us look a little more clearly into the doctrine which is so important that simply to recall it would have made the writing of this little work worthwhile. Is not virtue the health of the soul? And who will say that health does not affect the sight? And the occultist? Ask the occultist. An intelligent practitioner is not satisfied with measuring the curve of the crystalline lens. Ask the oculist. An intelligent practitioner is not satisfied with measuring the curve of the crystalline lens and choosing glasses. He does not merely advise ointments and lotions. He is curious about your general health, your teeth, your regime, your internal organs. Do not be surprised if that specialist in a single organ even questions you about your moral conduct. The sight of the spirit is no less exacting. Do you believe that we think with the intelligence only? Are we merely a bundle of faculties among which, for this or that purpose, we select the desired instruments? We think with our whole soul, declared Plato. Precisely, presently, we shall go much further. We shall say, with our whole being. Knowledge involves everything in us, from the vital principles to the chemical composition of the least cell. Mental disorders of every sort, states of delirium, hallucinations, asthenia, and hyposthenia, inadaptation to reality of whatever kind, prove that it is not the mind alone that thinks, but the man. How will you manage to think rightly with a sick soul, a heart ravaged by vice, pulled this way and that by passion, dragged away by violent or guilty love? There is, Gratry said, a clear-sighted and a blind state of the soul, a sound and therefore sensible state, and a state of folly. The exercise of the moral virtues, St. Thomas of Aquin tells you, in his turn, of the virtues by which the passions are held in check, is of great importance for the acquisition of knowledge. Yes, indeed, think it out. On what first and foremost does all the effort of study depend? On attention, which delimits the field for research, concentrates on it, brings all our powers to bear on it. Next, on judgment, which gathers up the fruit of investigation. Now passions and vices relax attention, scatter it, lead it astray, and they injure the judgment in roundabout ways of which Aristotle and many others after him have scrutinized the meanders. All contemporary psychologists are in agreement here. The fact is plain to see, admitting of no doubt. The so-called psychology of the feelings governs practice, but also to a large extent thought. Knowledge depends on the direction given to our passions and on our moral habits. To calm our passions is to awaken in ourselves the sense of the universal. To correct ourselves is to bring out the sense of the true. Carry your analysis further. What are the enemies of knowledge? Plainly, lack of intelligence. Therefore, in discussing vices and virtues and their role in the pursuit of knowledge, we presuppose persons who are equal in other respects, but stupidly apart. What enemies do you fear? What about sloth, the grave of the best gifts? What of sensuality, which makes the body weak and lethargic, befogs the imagination, dulls the intelligence, scatters the memory? Of pride, which sometimes dazzles and sometimes darkens, which so drives us in the direction of our own opinion that the universal sense may escape us. Of envy, which obstinately refuses to acknowledge some light other than our own. Of irritation, which repels criticism and comes to grief on the rock of error. Without these obstacles, a man of study will rise to heights greater or less according to his resources and his environment, but he will reach the level of his own gifts, of his own destiny. We must notice that all the faults just mentioned bring one another more or less in their train. They intersect, they ramify. They are, with regard to love of the good or contempt of the good, what intersecting streamlets are to the spring. Purity of thought requires purity of soul. That is a general and undeniable truth. The neophyte of knowledge should let it sink deeply into his mind. Let us rise higher, and speaking of springs, let us not forget the supreme spring. The surest metaphysic tells us that at the summit of things, the true and the good are not only connected, but are identical. We must state, for exactness' sake, that the good thus spoken of is not properly speaking moral good, desirable good, is what is directly referred to, but a little circuit brings us back from the latter to the formal. Moral good is nothing else than desirable good, measured by reason and set before the will as an end. Ends are related. They all depend on one ultimate end. It is this ultimate end which links up with the true and which is one with it. Connect these propositions and you will find that moral good, if not identical in every way with the true, still depends on it through the ends aimed at by the will. There is, therefore, between the two a bond more or less loose or close but unbreakable. It is not by the individuality in us that we approach truth. it is in virtue of a participation in the universal. This universal, which is at one and the same time the true and the good, cannot be honored as the true. We cannot enter into intimate union with it, discover its traces, and yield ourselves to its mighty sway, unless we recognize and serve it equally as the good. Climb up the great pyramid by those giant steps that so exactly represent the ascent of the true. That is, if you go up by the northern edge, can you reach the summit without getting nearer and nearer to the southern edge? To keep away from it would be to stay on the low levels. To turn away from it would be to go sideways and downwards. Similarly, the genius of the true tends of itself to join the good. If it diverges, it is at the expense of its upward impulse towards the summits. Blessed are the pure of heart, said the Lord. They shall see God. Preserve purity of conscience, says St. Thomas to his students. Do not fail to imitate the conduct of saints and of good men. Responsiveness of the soul to the ineffable spring, in filial and loving dispositions, lay it open to receive light after life, and ever-increasing fervor and rectitude. Truth, when loved and realized as a life, shows itself to be a first principle. One's vision is according to what one is. One participates in truth by participating in the spirit through whom it exists. Great personal intuitions, piercing lights, are in men of equal powers the consequence of moral progress, of detachment from self and from the usual commonplace of things, of humility, simplicity, discipline of the senses and of the imagination, of an eager impulse towards the great ends. There is no question now of proving one's skill, of showing off the brilliance of one's powers, as of a jewel. One desires to get into communion with the radiant center of light and life. One approaches this center in its unity, as it is. One adores it and renounces what is opposed to it in order to be flooded with its glory. Is not all that something like the meaning of the famous words, great thoughts come from the heart? It's from Pascal's Pensées. That's the end of the first section. Let's see if we've had any questions. Gouger's Ladder of Monks, the Lectio book. Let me see actually what the title of that book is. I think, though, it's just an introduction to Lectio Divina. No, it's Magrassi's introduction. So it's Praying the Bible, an introduction to Lectio Divina by Mariano Magrassi, who was an archbishop from Italy, ordained in 53, and he was an abbot of the Benedictine monastery of Santa Maria della Scala. So that's the one I'm going to look at. I chose it in particular because it's a very scholarly apparatus. I'm very impressed by it. I'm very impressed by its communication with the spiritual tradition. I mean, his citations are extremely numerous. Okay, let's see. Somebody says sounds like the Summa. Yeah, this is like the Summa. This book is drawing directly from Thomas over and over again. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, people. Yeah, he is. This is directly, especially. So this was written in. Let me see if I want to. I don't remember. I think this was written either in the very early 30s or in the late 20s, the first edition. And at that time, the dependence on Thomas as a source of general wisdom would have been very high because of the various injunctions of the Pope, starting with Leo XIII. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but I mean, if you read anything from this period, it's all going to be very reminiscent of Thomas, especially for a Dominican. But I mean, for a Dominican, if you read a Dominican or a Jesuit, you're going to be. It's like reading Thomas. It just will be because of the level of dependence. Okay. Section 2, which was entitled, lost it. There it is. Section 2, which is entitled The Virtue Proper to the Intellectual. I think studiousness is what it's going to cover if you want to link this to the Summa. Oh, I'm being silly. I didn't talk about this section. So this section is primarily about the relationship of the other virtues to the intellectual. I didn't know what I'm doing trying to skip over that. So, I mean, the basic point is that if you suffer vices, it won't matter your sort of particular intellectual quality. These other vices will be an impediment to your intellectual achievement. They'll get in the way. So, and you'll often see this with intellectuals who think that they can get away with sort of just being good scholars or whatever, and then they lead whatever life. Well, inevitably, the problems of the rest of their life impact their work. There is no such thing as, a man that is at the heights of his abilities only in one virtue, who is radically deficient in the others. Which is not to say that, it's not to say that sort of you can't have a kind of relative deficiency. If you have sort of one kind of talent or sort of relative virtue, and sort of there's others that lag behind. You're not that brave, but you're very diligent. That might be fine. But if you have a positive vice, so if you're cowardly, your diligence will suffer, because in as far as your diligence relies on not being unduly afraid, the cowardice is going to get in the way, and it doesn't matter how otherwise diligent you are. It's the same thing in the intellectual life. He's saying if you suffer envy, you will not get beyond. You'll not get beyond a sort of narrow inability to not take into account, things that you do need to hear from other people, and your intellectual work will suffer. And most people won't tell you that. You can't be caught up in terrible vices and still be dedicated to the truth, at least to the full extent of your calling. But that's the point of that section. Section 2, which is entitled The Virtue Proper to the Intellectual. We say then that virtue in general is necessary for knowledge, and that the more moral rectitude we bring to study, the more fruitful the study is. Yet there is a virtue proper to the intellectual, and we must dwell on it here, although it will recur often in the course of these pages. The virtue proper to the man of study is clearly studiousness. Do not jump to the conclusion that this is a naive statement. That is, our masters in doctrine have included many things in that virtue and have distinguished from it many other things. St. Thomas placed studiousness under the heading of the controlling virtue of temperance, to indicate that of itself knowledge is no doubt always to be welcomed, but that our life is so ordered as to require us to temper, that is, to adapt to circumstances and to reconcile with other duties a thirst for knowing that may easily run to excess. When I say to excess, I mean in both directions. To the virtue of studiousness, two vices are opposed, that is, negligence on the one hand, vain curiosity on the other. We shall not speak here of the former. It is not hateful to the reader. If it is not hateful to the reader when he comes close to this little book, it will be because he has grown weary on the way, or because we have managed the journey very badly. It is not the same with curiosity. This fault can creep in under cover of our best instincts and vitiate them at the very moment that it pretends to satisfy them. We have already referred to the ambitious ideas which pervert an intellectual vocation. Without going as far as that, ambition may injure studiousness and hinder the usefulness of its results. An act of ambition, apropos of knowledge, ceases to be an act of the pursuit of knowledge, and he who indulges in it ceases to deserve the name of an intellectual. Every other faulty purpose would call for the same verdict. On the other hand, study, even when it is disinterested and right in itself, is not always opportune. If it is not, the person who then pursues knowledge forgets his duty as a man. And what is to be said of the intellectual who is not a man? Other duties than study are human duties. Knowledge taken in an absolute sense is no doubt our supreme good, but the modicum of it that is granted to us here is often subordinated to other values which, in regard of merit, will be its equivalent. A country priest who devotes himself to his parishioners, a doctor who turns away from study to give help in urgent cases, a young man of good family who adopts a calling to help his people and, in doing so, has to turn his back on liberal studies, are not profaning the gift that is in them. They are paying homage to the true, which is one and the same being with the good. If they acted otherwise, they would offend truth no less than virtue, since indirectly they would be setting living truth at variance with itself. One sees many men avid for knowledge who do not hesitate to sacrifice to it their strictest duties. They are not men of study, they are dilettanti, or else they abandon the study demanded by their obligations and take up some other that flatters their inclinations, and their loss of quality is the same. Those who aim at what is beyond their powers, and thus run the risk of falling into error, who waste their real capacity in order to acquire some capacity that is illusory, are also men of curiosity in the olden sense. 2 of St. Thomas's 16 precepts for study concern them. Altiora te ne cresceris, do not seek what is beyond your reach. Volo ut per rivulos non stitim in mare eligas introire. I want you to decide to go to the sea by the streams, not directly. Precious advice, which serves knowledge as well as virtue by giving balance to the man. Do not overload the foundation. Do not carry the building higher than the base permits, or build all before the base is secure. Otherwise, the whole structure is likely to collapse. What are you? What point have you reached? What intellectual substructure have you to offer? These are the things that must wisely determine your undertaking. If you want to see things grow big, plant small. Say the foresters, and that is, in other words, St. Thomas's advice. The wise man begins at the beginning and does not take a second step until he is made sure of the first. That is why self-taught men have so many weak points. They cannot, all by themselves, begin at the beginning. When they join a group already well on the road, they find themselves at a stage where other stages have already been passed, and there is no one to show them the approaches. On the other hand, what is true of each one as to the stages of his development is true of each one in relation to others. We must not overestimate ourselves, but we must judge of our capacity. To accept ourselves as we are is to obey God and to make sure of good results. Does nature seek to exceed her powers? Everything in nature is exactly measured, without vain effort and without false estimates. Every creature acts according to its quantity and quality, its nature and its power, and then is at peace. Man alone lives in pretentiousness and dissatisfaction. What wisdom and what virtue there is in judging oneself truly and in remaining oneself. You have a part that only you can play, and your business is to play it to perfection instead of trying to force fortune. Our lives are not interchangeable. Equally, by aiming too high and falling too low, one misses the path to the goal. Go straight ahead in your own way with God for guide. To this necessary prudence, St. Thomas adds the importance of not letting one's curiosity linger over earthly objects at the expense of the supreme object. Later on, we shall draw from that consequence which is important for the organization of our work. But study must first of all leave room for worship, prayer, direct meditation on the things of God. Study is itself a divine office, an indirect divine office. It seeks out and honors the traces of the Creator, or his images, according as it investigates nature or humanity. But it must make way at the right moment for direct intercourse with him. If we forget to do this, not only do we neglect a great duty, but the image of God in creation comes between us and him, and his traces only serve to lead us far from him to whom they bear witness. Study carried to such a point that we give up prayer and recollection, that we cease to read Holy Scripture and the words of the saints and of great souls. Study carried on to the point of forgetting ourselves entirely and of concentrating on the objects of study so that we neglect the divine dweller within us is an abuse and a fool's game. To suppose that it will further our progress and enrich our production is to say that the stream will flow better if its spring is dried up. The order of the mind must correspond to the order of things. In the world of reality, everything rises toward the divine. Everything depends on it, because everything springs from it. In the effigy of the real within us, we can note the same dependence unless we have turned topsy-turvy the true relations of things. Okay. Let's see if we have anything. Okay, we're still no questions in the chat, but let's make sure. Okay, let's make sure. So let me see if I have any remarks. Not too many. So the key virtue we're talking about here is studiousness, if you want to look it over in the Summa. Now he says to make sure to remember that studiousness is under the master virtue of temperance. It's a sub-virtue. It's not a freestanding virtue, but it's a facet of temperance. And that should be obvious. I mean, studiousness is, like, if you want to think of reading books, sticking to books, studying, what's most necessary? Well, temperance, self-control. A man who doesn't have self-control is not capable of studying. I mean, what's he going to do? Like, you can't learn history or calculus or something because while you're compulsively partying. That doesn't make sense. So that's the primary controlling virtue. But he says to also remember that, studiousness under this virtue is going to yield to temperance generally. So you're not, this happens in the intellectual life. You're not going to want to, well, he says first, you're not going to want to get into neglect, but if you're here with me and we're reading this and we're talking about this, it's not a problem. But you're also not going to want to get caught up in frivolity and curiosity. This is sort of related to what we were talking about earlier with, people who get off in polemics but I mean, it doesn't have to be that. You just get off into learning about things just because, to the neglect of other things of importance. And that's a danger all the time. And, when we're getting to know things broadly, we don't need to worry about that. But, it so happens that when you're trying to focus, it's very easy to get sidetracked and lost in things that are not important. And not only that, but he speaks of neglecting other duties. I mean, if you're, a mother or a father, and you're neglecting your parental duties to satisfy an intellectual calling, that might not be appropriate. And you might need to work on that. And nobody is neglecting studiousness to take up, necessary practical affairs. And this, of course, is not a call to do so. You know, and many people, many scholarly people, do things like that. And it's one thing when Socrates famously neglects his family and his worldly dignity and his wife for reasons of studiousness. And there's a certain tolerability to that, but on the other hand, there's a certain inappropriateness to it as well. A man should take care that he have proper dignity, even when he's working on intellectual things. And this is a problem many people interested in things of the mind fall into, and many eccentrics. I've fallen into it myself from time to time. It's a non-trivial issue. So the slovenly intellectual, the nerd who doesn't take care of things appropriate to his station. That might be venial on a certain level, but it can also be a mortal vice. And so you need to be aware of it. Let's see. He speaks also of he speaks also of not going beyond how do I say this? Because I don't want to just repeat his language. He speaks of not flattering yourself by some kind of vain inclination. So, I'm not seeing this a lot with people in these circles, but it is not unusual in other circles to take up the study of something because you pretentiously believe, that it's, suited to your abilities. You take up some study or another because you want to show how smart you are to other people or to yourself. Sort of a kind of frivolous vanity gets involved into it. And this is not really in keeping with studiousness at all. It's usually it involves a lot of other vices. It certainly involves a lack of temperance. You're not, or you can take up. So sometimes people will try to grasp something too broadly or too quickly, or much more fully than they ought to, and they're not willing to start at the beginning or start with fundamentals. And this is also contrary to studiousness. And I certainly fell into this. You really need to start, because I don't like boring things, and I have problems. I've certainly had problems with mathematics because I don't like beginning steps and I don't like tedious exercises. Mathematics and language, I've always had problems because of tedious exercises. And you have to do some beginning stuff like that for some things. And trying to jump ahead or get around it is not in accord with studiousness. It's positively opposed. And as he says from Thomas, you have to go by the tributary, not straight into the sea. Tributary is a little narrow river that flows into the sea, as opposed to the sea, which is a big, broad thing. You need to come in, or just to give an analogy, if you want to, do physics or whatever, you need to be coming in through the fundamentals of mechanics. You don't need to just be picking up the latest physics journal and start diving. You really need a foundation and a formation. And some people don't want to do it. And that's a vice. Let's see, what else did he talk about? Talked about pretentiousness. Pretentiousness is not necessary or helpful in learning. Get rid of it. You would think that would be obvious, but alas. Oh, and he says, I don't know that this is a problem for anybody who's going to be working on this and needs to be integrated into the study plan, but you don't neglect prayer or the other things that you need to do to study. It won't help you. The whole spiritual life has to be integrated into this task. You can't shunt one off into the other. Let me see if there's any chat stuff. Let's see. No, nothing serious. Okay. Let's keep going. We do section 3 now. Section 3, as we said before, is entitled The Spirit of Prayer. These dispositions will be secured if, apart from the exercises of piety which precede our study, we cultivate in work itself the spirit of prayer. It is again St. Thomas who tells the passionate seeker after knowledge, Oratione vecare non desinos, that is, never give up praying. And von Helmont explains this precept when he says these sublime words, every study is a study of eternity. We repeat continually that science, scientia, is a knowledge by causes. Details are nothing, that is, facts are nothing, that is, the important things are the dependencies, the transmissions of influence, the connecting links, the exchanges which constitute the life of nature. Now behind all these dependencies is the primal dependence. At the spot to which all connections converge is the supreme bond. At the highest point of all transmissions, the spring. Beneath the exchanges, the gift. Beneath the systole and the dystole of the world, the heart, the boundless heart of beating. Must not the mind refer back to it unceasingly and never for a minute lose touch with what is thus the all of things, and consequently of all knowledge? Intelligence only plays its part fully when it fulfills a religious function, that is, when it worships the supreme truth in its minor and scattered appearances. Each truth is a fragment which does not stand alone, but reveals connections on every side. Truth in itself is one, and the truth, capital T, is God. Every truth is a reflection. Behind the reflections and giving it value is the light. Every being is a witness. Every fact is a divine secret. Beyond them is the object of the revelation, the hero witnessed to. Everything true stands out against the infinite as against its background. It is related to it, belongs to it. A particular truth may indeed occupy the stage, but there are boundless immensities beyond. One might say a particular truth is only a symbol that is real, a sacrament of the absolute. It is a sign and it exists, but not of itself. It does not stand of itself. It lives by what it borrows and would die if left to its own instability. Hence, for the fully awakened soul, every truth is a meeting place. The sovereign thought invites ours to the sublime meeting. Shall we miss it? The life of the real is not entirely in what we see, in what we can analyze by knowledge. The real has a hidden life like Jesus, and this life is also the life in God. It is, as it were, a life of God. It is a relation of his wisdom in laws, of his power in effects, of his goodness in the usefulness of things, of his tendency to diffuse himself in exchange and growth. It is a kind of incarnation which we must venerate and love, keeping in contact with him who thus embodies himself. To separate this so-called body of God from his spirit is to abuse it, just as it is an abuse of Christ to see in him the man only. The incarnation of Christ leads up to communion in which the body, blood, soul, and divinity of the Savior are not separated. The quasi-incarnation of God and being, of eternal truth in every separate instance of the truth, should also lead up to a heavenly ecstasy, instead of our absent-minded investigations and commonplace feelings of admiration. Let us make up our minds to work under the protective wing of the great laws and under the supreme law. Neither knowledge nor any other manifestation of life should be separated from its roots in the soul and in reality, where the God of the heart and the God of heaven are revealed and are one. Unity must be established among our acts, including the act of learning, and our thoughts, and our primal realities. In everything let us have the whole soul, the whole nature, and of duration, and divinity itself with us. We must add that to attain this spirit of prayer in study, it is not necessary to give oneself up to any mysterious incantation. No extrinsic effort is required. It is true that to call on God and to invoke his special intervention is in place here. St. Thomas always prayed before dictating or preaching. He composed an admirable prayer for this use. That's the one, by the way, that we pray at the beginning of what we're doing. The child in knowledge, stammering in his effort at expression, most naturally looks to find the word he wants in the glance of God. But in knowledge itself, in Christian knowledge, we have the stepping stool which raises us a little toward God, so that we return to study with a soul enlightened and in a sense with the gifts of the prophet. Everything that instructs us leads to God in a hidden byway. Every authentic truth is in itself eternal, and its quality of eternity towards us toward the eternity of which it is the revelation. Through nature and the soul, where can we go if not towards their origin? If one does not get there, it is because one has not gone off the path, and one bound the inspired and right mind. At one bound, the inspired and right mind goes beyond intermediaries and every question that arises within it. Whatever particular answer it may make, a secret voice says God. Therefore, we have only to leave the mind on the one hand to its upward flight, on the other its attention, and there will be set up, between the object of a particular study and the object of religious contemplation, an alternating movement which will profit both. With a rapid and often unconscious impulse, we pass from the trace or the image to God, and then coming back with new vigor and strength, we retrace the footsteps of the divine walker. We now find things have a deeper meaning, are magnified. We see in them an episode of an immense spiritual happening. Even while we busy ourselves with some trifling thing, we feel ourselves dependent on truths in comparison with which the mountains are ephemeral. Infinite being and infinite duration enfold us, and our study is in very truth, quote, a study of eternity, end quote. Okay, so this is talking about, so first of all, you have to remember, and this is obviously a consecrated religious person, you have to remember that we're called to pray always. That's a fundamental truth of spiritual theology. And being called to pray always, that means that our work, that our intellectual work, has to be itself an act of prayer and an interaction with God. And what he's saying is that when you do intellectual work, you're going to be directing yourself to God by way of the study you're making. So, a physicist who comes to learn about nature and physics is also learning about the work of God. And if he keeps mindful of God, and if he keeps mindful of the wonder of the things that he's learning about, the things that he's learning about will direct him back to their Creator, and will lead him to better contemplation of the Creator. But this contemplation of the Creator in meditative prayer, this meditative prayer and this contemplation of the Creator and this reverence for God will then enlighten his own study. So there's a circle. So you learn about things, and by learning about things you learn about God, and then by learning about God you turn to God, and then in contemplating God himself you learn better about things, because God is the creator of those things. And so when you return to the things, they're enlivened by what you have come to contemplate in God, which then allows you further to explore the things in light of God's having created them. And it's sort of a back and forth spiritual movement. And this is very important for the intellectual vocation understood as a Christian and Catholic vocation, and it certainly is. Okay. Since there's no... Oh, we have a chat question. Oh, Chris is here. Hey, buddy. Let's see. Chris says, I wonder if this is meant to be in distinction to the modern concept of philosophy as a means to power, and the postmodern concept of philosophy as a futile means to power. Well, that's complicated. So, on one hand, yeah, if by power you sort of mean the privative personal power. Now, there's a bridge period in history around the time of the Renaissance and early modernity where the pursuit of power is also understood as the pursuit of the power of God. So, you know, the Kabbalah and the occult, these are pursuits of power, but they're not pursuits of your own instrumental power. They're pursuits of the secret power of God that God might give you. So there is a question of blurring when you think on this, and you know, it is easy to distort the concept that's being articulated here out of Thomas into something like the modern desire, because the occult is still alive. The desire to take what is God's and to use it has to be remembered. So it's not simply enough to reject modernity with a simple return to knowledge as knowledge of the things of God, because there's still the temptation, the Promethean temptation, to attempt to take from God his power, which of course is stupid and futile, but man puffs himself up in pride. But yeah, on a direct level, yes, but it has to be thought about. Chris goes on to say, or if it's purely a positive idea about the goal of the intellect in an abstract study. No, I think it's both. I think you were right. He might not say, especially since he's writing before the Second World War, he might not put that emphasis, although, you know, still. But after the Second World War, that would have been pretty consistent as a theme about power and against knowledge as mere instrumental means. But he doesn't seem to have a strong awareness on that. He's older. He's from the older school. If he had been born early in the century, it might be different. Patrick says, modern philosophy is mostly an autistic back and forth on technicalities. You know, it depends on what you mean. If you mean contemporary analytic philosophy, yeah, to a certain extent. Although not always. Not always. I actually think contemporary analytic ethics sometimes hits interesting things. Comes in and out, fades in and out. It wakes up and gets a hold of something and then falls back asleep. But I don't think it's merely autistically technical on everything. And of course, you do have to have autistic technicalities, because what do we talk about? We talked about beginning at the beginning. And beginning at the beginning is often going to be, as it were, a lot of autistic technicalities. You know, I mean, the proper beginning of languages is a lot of autistic technicalities. But you know, you don't have a choice. So that's not enough. But you know, you can get lost in these things. There's of course a frivolity to it, but never pick up a subject matter and just go, this is a lot of autistic technicalities. And the truth has a lot of technicalities. And it's not good enough as a critique. Chris says, is the occult really modern? It always struck me as pre-modern. The occult... The occult, as it is presently enjoyed, and as it inaugurated early modernity, is pre-modern in a particular way, but it's going into modernity. So the occult in the ancient mode is the mystery cult. It's the secret, Gnostic, esoteric knowledge that will save me. That's the occult for ancient people. It's I don't I want to have the inside story of the gods, so that I don't that I don't. It's prideful in a way, but it's also nervous. The ancient man is nervous that his supplications in the ordinary ways to the ordinary cults won't be sufficient, that or that the deity he is propitiating won't be propitiated in the right way, or that the propitiation will not be efficacious because it doesn't know everything it needs to know. The ancient man is nervous after revelation and wants to find it. The early modern man is also after a hidden revelation, but he wants it specifically to bring about manifest results in the world. He is turning away from both the afterlife and his spiritual life here, and he's turning to temporal life here. The alchemist wants certain effects here, maybe for spiritual purposes, but he wants to see them here. The Kabbalist or the magician wants certain effects here. Also, although maybe he also wants spiritual effects. So it's not simply a pre-modern repetition. Chris goes on to say, by the way, not to jump ahead, but does the author describe the directing of knowledge to God as the unification of knowledge into the full being of the knower, rather than holding it as abstraction? Yeah, I don't remember the exact language that he's going to use, but I mean, of course, this is about the spiritual life, and this book's ultimately a book in spiritual theology, and so we're going to be aiming at unity with God in the spiritual life, in the spirit. We're not going to be aiming at mere abstract knowledge of God. And I don't think he's actually particularly preoccupied with abstract knowledge of God in this book, although he may mention it. But theology, which does not animate the spiritual life, is certainly far from what he's saying. Let's see now. Move to section 4. Section 4 is entitled The Discipline of the Body. We've already said that the doctrine of the composite nature of man forbids us to disassociate spiritual functions from even those corporal functions that are apparently least connected with pure thought. St. Thomas subscribes to this ironical notion of Aristotle thus: it is as ridiculous to say the soul alone understands as to say alone it builds or weaves. He himself advances the following proposition, which looks materialistic, saying, the different dispositions of men for the operations of the soul depend on the different dispositions of their bodies. To a good bodily constitution corresponds the nobility of the soul. That need not surprise us, though it is born in us after long processes of preparation in which the whole bodily machine is at work. The chemistry of the cell is the basis of everything. The most obscure sensations prepare our experience. This experience is the product of the work of the senses, which slowly elaborate their acquisitions and fix them through memory. It is amid psychological phenomena, in continuity with them and in dependence on them, that the intellectual operation takes place. No one thinks, even if he is only utilizing an acquired idea, without calling up a whole complex of images, emotions, sensations, which are the culture medium of the idea. When we want to awaken a thought in anyone, what are the means at our disposal? One only, to produce in him by word and sign states of sensibility and of imagination, emotion, and memory, in which he will discover our ideas and make it his own. Minds can only communicate through the body. Similarly, the mind of each one of us can only communicate with truth and with itself through the body. So much so that the change by which we pass from ignorance to knowledge must be attributed, according to St. Thomas, directly to the body, and only antecedently to the intellectual part of us. Should not this doctrine, continually recurring in the Master's teaching, and so essentially, so providently modern, engender the conviction that in order to think, and especially in order to think ardently and wisely throughout a lifetime, it is indispensable to subject to the requirements of thought not only the soul and its various faculties, but also the body and the whole complex of its organic functions. In an intellectual, everything must be intellectual. The physical and mental composite, the substance of man, are at the service of that special life which in some aspects seems hardly human. That is, let them place no hindrance in the way. Let us make ourselves a harmony of which the result will be the conquest of the true. Now, there are here two considerations that must be faced without any human respect, although the first customarily startles spiritual persons who lack firmness of judgment. First, then, do not be ashamed to endeavor to keep well. Some men of genius have had miserly bad health, and if it is God's will that should happen to you, there's no more to be said. But if it is your own fault, it is a very guilty instance of tempting God. Are you quite sure that, following the example of men of genius, you will, like them, have enough vigor to triumph in the incessant struggle of the soul against the weakness of the flesh? There's no proof that these great men themselves have not had their talents turned astray or dimmed by their physiological defects. Many intellectual anomalies in the most gifted men might perhaps thus be explained, and so might the limited production of some among them. In men of otherwise equal gifts, is it certain that sickness is a serious handicap? It lessens the output. It interferes with the freedom of the soul at the moment of its delicate operations. It sidetracks attention. It may warp the judgment of the effects in imagination and the nervous reactions that suffering brings about. A disease of the stomach changes a man's character. His character changes his thoughts. If Lepardi had not been delicate and deformed, would he have been among the pessimists? When, therefore, you resolve to live on a high level, do not imagine that it is taking a low stand to consider carefully, along with the activity of thought itself, all the particulars of its organic structure. A sound mind and a sound body remains the ideal. The thinker has a special physiology. He must look after it, and not hesitate to take expert advice on the matter. In any case, ordinary current rules must be obeyed. Sound hygiene is almost for you an intellectual virtue. Among our moderns, whose philosophy is sometimes so poor, the science of hygiene is rich. Do not despise it. It will enrich your philosophy. Live as much as possible in the open air. It is a recognized fact that attention, the nerve of study, is closely related to breathing, and for general health we know that plenty of oxygen is a first consideration. Windows open or partly open day and night when prudence allows, frequent deep breathing exercises, combined with movements that amplify them and make them normal, walks before and after, or even combined with work according to Greek tradition, all these practices are excellent. It is important to work in a position that gives free play to the lungs and does not compress the other organs. It is good from time to interrupt a spell of close application in order to breathe deeply, to stretch one's limbs in 2 or 3 rhythmic movements, which relax the body and even prevent it from getting wrinkles. It has been found that slow and deep breaths, taken standing on tiptoe, with the windows open, are still more effective as a relaxing agent. Neglect nothing where your health is concerned. Every day you should take exercise. Remember the saying of an English doctor thus: those who do not find time to take exercise must find time to be ill. If you cannot take exercise in the open air, there are excellent substitute methods. That of J.P. Mueller is one of the most intelligent, and there are others. For a change, some easy manual work is precious for mind and body. Our fathers knew that, but our age is a mad age that mocks at nature, and nature takes a revenge. Set aside every year, and secondarily, in the course of the year, time for real vocations, by which I do not mean the entire absence of work. That would relax the excess faculties already sufficiently inclined to instability, but the predominance of rest, fresh air, and exercise out of doors. Look after your diet. Light food, plain, moderate in quantity, and simply cooked, will enable you to work more freely and alertly. A thinker does not spend his life in the processes of digestion. Pay still more attention to your sleep. Take neither too much or too little. Too much will make you heavy, stupid, will slow up the blood and the power of thinking. Too little will expose you to the risk of prolonging unduly the stimulation of work and dangerously superimposing strain upon strain. Watch yourself. In this question of sleep, as in that of food, find how much you need and make a firm resolution to keep to it. There is no general rule. To sum up, you must understand that for an intellectual, care of the body, which is the instrument of the soul, is virtue and wisdom. St. Thomas explicitly attributes this character to it and includes this wisdom for the body among the elements that contribute to temporal beatitude, the first beginning of the other beatitude. Do not turn into a wizened and stunted creature, a failure, who later on might be dull-witted, an old man before his time, and therefore a foolish steward of the talent entrusted to him by the master. But the care of our bodily partner includes other elements also. We have spoken of the passions and vices as formidable enemies of the mind. We were thinking then of their psychological effects, of the disturbances that they cause in the judgment, and in the habitual tendency of the mind, which, when they reach a certain degree, they turn into a power of darkness. Now we are considering their physical effects, which indirectly are again diseases of the soul. If one remains lazy, a glutton, a slave of the pillow and of the table, if one abuses wine, alcohol, tobacco, if one forgets oneself among unwholesome excitements, clinging to habits that are both debilitating and nerve exhausting, to sins that are perhaps periodically forgiven, but of which the effects remain, how can one practice the hygiene of which we have urged the necessity? A lover of pleasure is an enemy of his body, and therefore quickly becomes an enemy of his soul. Mortification of the senses is necessary for thought, and can alone bring us that state of clear vision, of which Gregory spoke. If you obey the flesh, you are on the way to become flesh, whereas you must become all spirit. Why is St. Thomas called the angelic doctor? Is it only because of his winged genius? No, it is because everything in him was subordinated to his brilliant and holy mind, because his flesh, native to the coasts of the Tyrrhenian Sea, had taken on the witness of the Carmel and the Hermon, because, being chaste, temperate, quick to follow his soaring inspiration, and far from all excess, he was wholly a soul, an intelligence served by organs, according to the famous definition. I say to you, Catholic workers, and especially to you young men, that discipline and mortification of the body, along with the necessary care of it, of which in themselves they form the better part, are among the most precious safeguards of your future. Okay, let's see. So in this section, of course, he talks about health of the body. And I'll tell you right now from experience, if you don't do at least some exercise, if you don't take care of your diet, if you don't take care of your sleep, your mental abilities are going to suffer, either directly because it'll cloud the mind, or indirectly because you'll fall into some mood disorder or other psychological disorder, or a physical disorder, and you won't be able to work, or you won't be able to work well, or you won't be able to work for long periods of time. This is just a fact. You need to be doing a little physical, you need to be walking and moving around. You need to have some activity in your life to keep up a serious mental life, and to keep up prayer life. If you are physically messed up, you won't pray correctly. It's going to mess up your ability to speak with God. That needs to be considered. If you're obese, fix it. I used to be very thin. I'm not, a big guy now, but I mean, 180 pounds now. It's acceptable weight for a man of my height, but I used to be about 135, 140 pounds for a long time. And it affected my mood, it affected my ability to work, it affected my ability to think, it affected all sorts of parts of my life. And you have to take care of those things. You can't neglect them just because you think that you sort of have a non-physical calling. Now, this is true for everything. This is not just true for scholarly things. It's true for everything. Whatever you do, if you neglect the body, whatever else it is that you do will suffer. And that doesn't mean you need to become, Chad bodybuilder kind of thing. That actually might create other problems. But you need to be as healthy as you can be within reason. And you take care of your diet and everything. And, with prudently and simply. Let's see what the chat says. Let's see. Okay, Chris asks, do you see a parallel with the emphasis on caring for health with the monastic emphasis on work, as well as the rule of the day, which enforces sufficient sleep and food? I mean, yeah, straightforwardly. Although I don't think at this time, I'd have to look at how the Dominicans operate. But I suspect that the Dominicans weren't so strict on that as contemporary Benedictines might be, but at least in principle, yeah. I mean, all the Benedictine writing and literature will tell you how important work and schedule and structure and prayer and sleep and all that is for the spiritual life. The old anecdote is that the old monks would try to pray all the psalms every day and neglect other things, and it was bad for them. They weren't able to do it. It was not something that a man was capable of. It wasn't taking care of man's temporal limits as an incarnate creature. And so the Benedictine tradition has broken the Psalms down into a certain amount of times during the day, spaced out throughout the day, and interspersed with work and study and other necessary things. It's a very structured tradition, and it has produced, when it's been followed in the West, it's produced civilization. It civilized all of Northern Europe. It just did. That was a great success. Let's see. Oh, Chris says, right towards the end there was some language which feels a little Gnostic, that part about reading to become pure spirit. Well, so, there is a worry about it, but I don't think he means that in the Gnostic sense at all. And, we do have to understand that, he almost certainly means that in the mystic sense, in the Dionysus the Areopagite sense. And of course, there is a sense in which we're trying to become pure spirit, in the sense that we're trying to unify ourselves with God, we're trying to divinize ourselves, and in that sense to become pure spirit. But obviously, just the fact that we're taking care of the body and that we're concerned with the right order of the body, we're not trying to become pure spirit in the strange Gnostic sense, which is not given to us. I think he more means that the body needs to be ordered so as to serve its spiritual purpose. When he's saying this, I don't think he means, he's a very orthodox man, so I don't think he means that, except poetically. I don't suspect of Gnosticism at all. And language like that comes up all the time in the spiritual theology tradition of the church. So we need not take it in a dangerous sense. And just be aware of it and what its excesses are. But the knowledge, the danger of a kind of Manichaean Gnosticism is not really acute in this age. We have other dangers in this age, so I don't worry too hard about it. Let's see. Recent brain research shows correlation between exercise and brain to increase neuroplasticity. A Canadian coined the phrase, "What fires together wires together." Yeah, and if you don't exercise, if you don't walk or jog or weightlift. Weightlifting is actually really good and important. Like, people try to jog their way to health, and they could make a lot more gains just by weightlifting, strength training more frequently. But you should work on all these things at least to plateau, or and you could just observe as you get stronger and as you move around more frequently. You could observe your own mental experience getting better and your mood improving, and lots of other things will come along. So not just cosmetic things, but internally you'll notice psychological differences. It's really elementary, but people don't take care of it because it's difficult and it's a problem. Let's see. Do you think it's recoverable to hold that, Chris says, do you think it's recoverable to hold that even an intellectual has a duty to be steward of the matter that makes up his body, the body being good, other than as an instrumentalist view of health? Yeah, no, I think that, I don't recall anyway, although he says stuff like that about other things, so you could probably, by way of extension, get there. But I don't think the author himself says that. But yeah, it's perfectly, as we say, God, and we've never, mortification and, there's a distinction to be made between mortification of the body and dismissal, neglect, or hatred of the body. Those are not, God's put us in the body. It's God's providence that we're incarnate. It was God's providence that he himself incarnated in a body. So hatred and Manichaean sort of opposition of the body to the spirit in an absolute sense is not appropriate for a Christian. Our goal is not to live a life detached from the body in such an extreme way that the body is not important. And on top of that, I think Chris is pointing out something, and it's a good thought, that this being placed in the body is not merely instrumental. That's not really, it's closer to the truth, but the instrumental view of the body is a really thin. It's certainly, I think it's certainly in contrary with the incarnation of Christ, and I think it's a very thin view of the duty given to us by God. I'll start with the incarnation, and I'll talk about the duty given to us by God. So, with respect to the incarnation, it's Christ. It's if you're going to have the view that the body is sort of instrumentally, you're going to end up at a very Nestorian view. Like, Christ doesn't incarnate sort of just as an example to the people, or as a kind of puppeting of some vessel, so that he gets the message out and then can leave. That's not really the point. The human being is not merely spiritually but physically an imago Dei, and Christ fulfills the fact that we're an image of God by becoming the full presence of God in the incarnation, in the image. He's both the image. He's the sign that signifies. He's the sign that affects what it signifies. Christ is this sort of the living sacrament. Because why? Because the human body and the human being was already an image of God. And then in the incarnation, God comes to the full presence of himself in that image that was already an image of himself. So then the sign becomes the thing and affects the thing in the presence and ministry of God. In the presence and ministry of God as Jesus Christ. And that gives you that's not merely instrumental. It's not that God used this as one sort of trivial means among others. I mean, he could have just kept doing burning bushes and miracles and pillars of fire and stuff. Why be in a human body? Well, because the human body has a not merely instrumental purpose. It has a signifying purpose. It has a it's designed to be the vessel of the fullness of God on earth. From the beginning, providentially, it was so designed. Now, also on the side of stewardship, God's given us the whole earth, and he's given whatever providential position we've been put in for a reason. And so you don't shun the body as if it was some kind of accident. That's a neglected duty. God wants you to take care of the things he's given you, including your body. And that shouldn't be treated as a triviality, of course. Yeah, so it would have to preclude a mere treatment of the body as some kind of instrument for our spiritual good. That's not right. That's not right at all. And that's not in accord with the Catholic tradition at all, of the treatment of the body at all. Let's see, what else? I had wanted to say something else about this section. If I didn't already say it, I think it's past me. Sleep. I didn't mention sleep. And I still haven't gotten disciplined on this either, but sleep's important. I sleep too much or too little. I have both problems. But you should sort of figure out the amount of sleep that's both necessary and adequate and stick to it on a schedule if you can. That's also important. Just yesterday after I got off, I went and took a nap. I didn't come out of the nap, and I slept way too long, and that'll mess you up. So get on that. Let's see. I'm going to do chapter 3. How long are we on? Oh, we're only on 2 hours. That's nothing. I'm going to do chapter 3, and then after I finish chapter 3, we'll quit, unless there's any other discussion. Chapter 3 is entitled The Organization of Life, and it has 6 subsections, and they're entitled as follows. Section 1 is Simplification. Section 2 is Solitude. Section 3 is Cooperation with one's fellows. Section 4 is Cultivation of necessary contacts. Section 5 is Safeguarding the necessary element of action. Section 6 is Preservation of interior silence. We'll start with Section 1, which was, as we said, Simplification. In order that everything in you should be directed towards your work, it is not enough to organize yourself within, definitely to settle your vocation and to make wise use of your powers. You must further arrange your exterior life, I mean in respect of its framework, its obligations, its contacts, its setting. One word suggests itself here before any other. You must simplify your life. You have a difficult journey before you. Do not burden yourself with too much baggage. Perhaps you are not absolutely free to do this, and so you think there is no use laying down rules. That is a mistake. Given the same external circumstances, a desire for simplification can do much, and what one cannot get rid of outwardly, one can always remove from one's soul. Thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass together, says the law. Wise and peaceful work must not be associated with the noisy and the spasmodic interruptions of a life all on the outside. Under this form, again, a certain asceticism is the duty of the thinker. Contemplation, whether religious or secular, scientific, artistic, or literary, is not compatible with the complications and burdens of an excessively comfortable life. Big men have little beds, notes Henry Lavedon. There is a luxury tax to be paid on intellectual greatness. Our talent will not be ruined by the 10%, which is the price of our privilege. The tax is paid, rather, by our faults, and certainly by our temptations, and this brings us to a double advantage. If you want to entertain knowledge as your guest, you do not need rare furniture, nor numerous servants. Much peace, a little beauty, certain conveniences that save time are all that is necessary. Slacken the tempo of your life. Receptions, visits that give rise to fresh obligations, formal intercourse with one's neighbors, all the complicated ritual of an artificial life that so many men of the world secretly detest, these things are not for a worker. Society life is fatal to study. Display and dissipation of mind are mortal enemies of thought. When one thinks of a man of genius, one does not imagine him dining out. Do not let yourself get entangled in that mesh of occupations which little by little monopolizes time, thought, resources, powers. Conventions must not dictate to you. Be your own guide. Obey your convictions, not mere custom, and the convictions of an intellectual must correspond to the goal at which he is aiming. Vocation means concentration. The intellectual is consecrated. Let him not scatter himself in exacting futilities. Let him throw all his resources into the fire of inspirations, as Bernard Palissy sacrificed his furniture. The work and the conditions that further it are the whole thing. Money and attention squandered on trifles would be much better spent in collecting a library, providing for instructive travel or restful holidays, going to hear music which rekindles inspiration, and so on. Whatever furthers your work is always timely. What impedes it and entangles you is to be put away, for besides the immediate drawbacks, you are thus driven to work for profit, and you defect your effort. The priest has the right to live by the altar, and the man of study by his work, but one does not say mass for money, and one must not think and write for money. Suppose you are of the number of those who have to earn their living otherwise than by the work they love. How will you preserve the few hours at your disposal if your life is overfull? You must reduce matter to the minimum, so as to lighten and liberate the spirit. In this respect, the wife of an intellectual has a mission that it is perhaps well to point out. It so often happens that she forgets it, and instead of being Beatrice, succeeds in being merely a spendthrift and a chatterbox. Every woman should espouse the career of her husband. The father's toil is always the center of gravity of the family. In that is productive life, and therefore also eventual duty. And this is all the truer the career embraced is nobler and more laborious. In such a case, life in common centers round something very lofty. The wife should take her stand on the height, instead of trying to draw the man's thought down from it. To draw the husband into trivial things that have no connection with his aspirations is to rouse in him an equal aversion for both these contradictory lives. Let the daughter of Eve think of this, and not give more cause than is just for St. Paul's de visus est. If the married man is in a certain sense divided, let him also be doubled. God has given him a helpmate like unto himself. Let her not become different. The friction caused by lack of understanding in the sister soul is fateful to production. It keeps the mind in gnawing disquiet. It destroys all its soaring eagerness and all its joy. And how could the bird fly without wings? How could bird or soul fly without their song? Let the guardian spirit of the hearth not be an evil genius, but its muse. Having married a vocation, let her have the vocation also. Whether she achieves something herself or through her husband, what does it matter? She must still achieve, since she is but one flesh with him who achieves. Without needing to be herself an intellectual, still less a woman of letters or blue stocking, she can produce much by helping her husband to produce, compelling him to keep watch on himself, to give of his best, helping him to recover after the inevitable lapses, buoying him up when he loses courage, consoling him for his disappointments without accentuating them through undue insistence, soothing his sorrows, being his sweet reward after his labors. After the effort of work, a man is like a wounded soldier. He needs to be surrounded with care and quiet. Do not force him. Let him relax and encourage him like an interest in what he is doing. Take an interest in what he is doing. Add your strength to his at the moment that he is, as it were, depleted by a perhaps excessive expenditure of himself. In short, be a mother to him. And this strong man, who is all weakness, will feel himself braced up and fresh for new struggles. Children complicate life, but so sweetly that they should serve to give the worker fresh courage rather than to lessen his resources. The little ones take much of you, and what good would they be if they did not now and then tease and tax you? But they hearten you just as much, and perhaps more. They can heighten your inspiration by mingling joy with it. They give you a love-lit reflection of nature and of man, and thus demand you against the abstract. They bring you back to the real, about which their questioning eyes are waiting for exact commentary from you. Their pure faces preach integrity, that sister of knowledge, and does not their readiness to believe, to hope, to have great dreams, and to expect everything from the fatherhood that guides them, does not this uplift you also? You man of thought, and give you motive for hope? You can set an image of God and a sign of our immortal destiny in this image of the future. Those who have renounced family life in order to devote themselves entirely to their work and to him who inspires it, have the right to rejoice, approaching the freedom procured them by their sacrifice. They will think of their brethren laden with responsibilities and repeat to themselves the smiling remark of Lacordaire about Ozanam. That is, there is one snare that he did not succeed in avoiding, marriage. But the worker, bound by these ties, can and must draw from them strength, inspiration, and one of the forms of his ideal. That's the end on the section. It's primarily about marriage and the difficulties of marriage because this is aimed at a general audience, and most men of a certain age are taken up with certain difficulties of family life. But you should also consider simplicity generally. I mean, most people today bring into their lives more complications than they need. They think what are luxuries or necessities. I mean, a man does not have to eat very complicated. It's possible in this present age to easily, in the West, to easily fulfill all of your food needs on, I mean, if you really wanted to. I mean, you could easily fulfill all your food needs on $2 to $3 a day. You know, if you want to get luxurious, $5, $10 or less a day, all of them. And you can live very simply. And the more frugal you are on things like this, on daily expenses like this, the less complications interfere with your work. I've always sort of lived simply with luxuries. Most of my luxury spending is on books. I don't spend a lot of money on entertainment because it's not necessary. And you'll find that all that luxury spending doesn't do you any good personally. It doesn't do you any good really socially. You don't meet anybody better for you with all this frivolity than you would if you had been more simple. It takes you away from what you really want to do if you have anything you really want to do. So unless you're just gifted with vast amounts of wealth for no effort, you start cutting things out, cutting them down wherever you can do it. You know, and that's why I mentioned food expenses. Most people spend way too much for no reason. He mentioned eating out. He also mentioned a lot of social things that people around the turn of the century spent time on that aren't so common today. But I mean, how much money do you spend on um, computer gaming or on on movies or on whatever? There's things people do now to dissipate all their money and time that add complications that they don't need to have. And you know, figure out what that is and cut it out or cut it down. You don't cut out everything. We're no misers. There's right recreation, but even if you have a hobby that's a recreation that's good for you, you don't. Sometimes you spend too much, or sometimes you put unnecessary complication into it. You don't have to have all the best gym equipment or whatever. Or you don't have to, have all the bells and whistles, everything. You can usually make do with average things and significantly simplify your life on a regular basis. Let's see what the chat says. Chris says, there's also the element that the greater serves the lesser. He would be a lord, must be servant of all, hence the intellect serving the body. That's back on the topic of the body. I didn't realize, but yes, that's true. Computing the soul. It's cool to see you here. Yeah. Chris says, he spent a little time on saying that a man should not think for money, but I think there's a lot to that. What is done for money must be done by compromise, and why most should not be an academic. Something that incels often miss is how much they can accomplish because of their deprivation. Yeah, so that's true. That's just true. And I talked about this yesterday when I talked about my experience looking at academia and why I said, you know what, I don't think so. But you it's the same for trying to be an author or trying to be, any of the various intellectual vocations. And I shouldn't use vocation here because it's reserved in this work for something else. But I mean, any of the various intellectual careers, you're going to be, if you take up any of the intellectual or creative careers, and not to say that nobody should do these, but you will be doing them in a way that compromises, almost always, that compromises what you're actually trying to do. Some rare people are gifted otherwise. But that's rare, and you should not envy them, and you should not seek after them unless it's given to you to be in that position. And it'll be obvious if it's given to you to be in after that position. And most people will not be given that opportunity. You will not, as a philosopher or a theologian or even a professor, even if you want to be a teacher, and there is some kind of, you will not be given vast sums of money for it. And the fullness of your work will usually not be involved in the work that makes you the money. Somebody might learn literature for, might learn literature, might learn to write, might be an incredibly talented and creative person, and then, go into being a high school English teacher. And there's nothing wrong with being a high school English teacher, but the fullness of his work will not be in what makes him money. Even then, even if he becomes a college professor, the fullness of his life and his work will not be in the employment. It just won't. Usually, 99 times out of 100, he won't find what he's doing in that work, and so you have to keep that in mind. And if you're trying to make money with it, you almost will not. You'll neither find. If you're trying to make money with the intellectual life, you almost always find neither the intellectual life nor the money. And if you find the money, you still usually won't find the intellectual life. I don't even want to say 99 times out of 100. I would say, 999 times out of 1,000, you won't. It's not common at all. at all. You can be successful as an above average writer can be successful as a writer, but he will not be writing what he wants. And even somebody very talented, even Hemingway or something like that, it's very hard to find an audience. It's very hard to make money. You could have done most of the time. You could have done 1,000 other things and done better financially than the thing you did that distracted all of your intellectual time. Let's see. Chris goes on to say, it's approximately extrinsic that things done for money are done by compromise because the money normally is exchanged for doing the will of another. Usually. But I wanted to point, this is why I brought up Hemingway. Even if, this is what the creative author is always a great case. Even if you are given, like, the will of the other basically is to do what you want. So you're seeking basically just audience approval and money from doing what comes to you. You'll find that you get run around trying to hit some kind of personal, like, basically best case scenario, you often are going to get caught up in your own seeking for fame and indulging other vices. And that's the best case scenario if you're doing it for the money. And that's if you can find it, which almost nobody does. Almost nobody in the history of the intellectual life has been wealthy by the intellectual life. Verena Fazio says, great advice on living simply. Hobby farming, sowing, and preserving foods are having a comeback. That's true. Although there's a real danger with that hobby farming and all that stuff where it's not really simple and it's all just hipster complication. The hipster microbrewery is not simple, and it's not practical, and it's not really for himself. So what often happens is that these people get into these endeavors and really they're reliant on the excess of resources of society around them, and they have not actually simplified their lives. They just take a complicated life, slice off a chunk of its resources, and then create a little model of simplicity, and don't actually simplify anything. And this isn't the best. And even if you can, sometimes, if you can be supported by others, this is how online grifters work. It's also how talented online people work. You get, and it's also, I don't want to name names because it's detraction. So we'll just say sometimes you'll even find certain religious societies, certain religious vocations, certain religious groups that have created a model of ancient simplicity, but are in fact reliant entirely on donations from people that don't live simple at all. And in a way that was very alien to the thing that they're recreating. So you'll say you'll create an old way of monastic life, but you neglect the fact that the old way of monastic life usually created around itself a village, and usually created around itself people who were dependent on that monastery for certain things and a whole social interaction. And you'll find these monasteries, they might have whole, fields of cows, but these cows, nobody really wants. Like, the dairy from the cows costs 5 times as much as what you could get from the store, and is not easily sold because the remoteness of the religious group, and is not high enough in volume to actually support the group. And the group has a really, beautiful and elaborate building and church and grounds, but none of this actually came from their labor. It just came from donations, which are, sort of emptily given by others because they like to see this model of simplicity that isn't actually simple because of what it's dependent on. And that's a thing. That's a real it's a real pathology. The the when I say simplify your life, I mean simplify a life. Simplify what it is that you actually do to actually live. If having a garden in your backyard helps you cut down on the complications of food, or is a very cheap and affordable hobby that helps you cut down on other luxuries that are complicating your life, good. But if having a if you're falling into hipster territory where it's really just a model of simplicity on top of a not on top of a refusal to actually simplify what you're actually doing, it can be a vice. Which is not to say that you don't do it, but you be mindful that when we say simplicity, we mean really, really simplify your real life. Um, it's actually change things. Don't just have some pocket that's looks like it's simple. Let's see. Chris says, I give young people the advice to do their second favorite thing as a living so they can do their primary position without compromise. That's true. Um, I have never done for a living anything I was very excited about. Now, I've never done, unless with very few circumstances or for instrumental purposes, I've never really done anything to make money I hate. Don't, and I mean, sometimes you have to. I'm not saying, if it's homelessness or, squalor or indignity or depression or disease, or, doing something you want to do. But I would say almost never should you do anything for money that you absolutely hate doing. And if you do have to, get out of it as soon as possible, even if it requires you to take something lower paying or more inconvenient. Not always within prudence, but do what you need to do and get out of it as quickly as you can, because it'll wreck. You can take it on as a mortification, of course, but it's usually beyond men to live like that, and you should get out of it as soon as possible. Or, you have to make an assessment. Is the hate frivolous? Sometimes we hate things and we shouldn't. That is to say, we refuse to take rightly ordered joy in things. You go to your office job and you have office work and you hate it. Well, what do you hate? You mean, you want it to be, the life of a wealthy man on vacation every day? Well, it's never going to be that, and you have inappropriate, disordered expectations. And so you need to mortify those and then see which joy you can find in this life that you hate. I mean, the farmer has a life of toil, but also there's a life of simple joy. And so, you should take the simple joys in the life that you have and not want them to be something else. But on the other hand, I mean, if you are in a truly detestable position, if you're in some sort of degrading work, or some sort of, by virtue of its condition, sort of undeniably miserable condition, and don't stay in it if you can get out of it. Leave as soon as possible. But otherwise, find a vocation that, like an employment that is tolerable and that you can have some joy in, and do that, and don't do this game where you try to make the thing that you really like and you're really good at your source of employment. Sometimes you'll be lucky, but don't expect it. And everybody teaches you otherwise, and it's usually bad advice. Let's see. Patrick says, I washed dishes at a restaurant when I was younger. You can always aim for mastery in minimal tasks like that, like improving your discipline. Yeah, you could, absolutely. And whatever you're doing, you should be aiming at self, you should be aiming at the virtues, and you should be aiming at, you know, God infuses in us faith, hope, and charity, and the fruits of these things are joy and peace. And even if you're in a difficult situation, even if you're in prison, if you've begun to occlude over the joy and peace of the Spirit, something's wrong. Which is not to say that you should fake happiness all the time, but you need to see if a sin is disturbing the supernatural joy God should be infusing in you, in whatever it is you're doing. And that means, even a dishwasher whose faith in God can be happy. Even a homeless man whose faith in God can be joyful in a certain respect, provided that he lacks attachment to sin, which destroys that infusion. Absolutely. Okay. This is section 2. Section 2, as we said before, is entitled Solitude. In the organization of our life, the essential point to safeguard, in view of which all the rest is necessary, is the wise provision of solitude, exterior and interior. St. Thomas is so deeply convinced of this that of 16 counsels to the intellectual, he devotes 7 to external contacts and to the retired life. I want you to be slow in speaking and slow in going to the parlor. Do not inquire at all about the actions of others. Be polite to everyone, but be familiar with none, for too much familiarity breeds contempt and gives matter for many distractions. Do not busy yourself about the words and actions of those in the world. Avoid useless outings above everything. Love your cell if you desire to be admitted to the wine cellar. The wine cellar mentioned here, in allusion to the Canticle of Canticles and to the commentary of St. Bernard, is the secret dwelling place of truth, of which from afar the perfume attracts the spouse, that is, the fervent soul. It is the abode of inspiration, the radiant center of enthusiasm, of genius, of invention, of ardent search. It is the scene of the activity of the mind and its wise delight. To enter into that dwelling, we must give up commonplace things. We must practice retirement, of which the monastic cell is the symbol. In the cells and among the great corridors, writes Paul Adam Dieu, page 67, silence is like a splendid person, clad in the whiteness of the walls, keeping watch. What does she keep watch over, if not prayer and work? Therefore, be slow to speak and slow to go to those places where people speak, because in many words the Spirit is poured out like water by your amiability to all. Purchase the right really to frequent only a few whose society is profitable. Avoid even with these the excessive familiarity which drags one down and away from one's purpose. Do not run after news that occupies the mind to no purpose. Do not busy yourself with the sayings and doings of the world, that is, with such as have no moral or intellectual bearing. Avoid useless comings and goings, which waste hours and fill the mind with wandering thoughts. These are the conditions of that sacred thing, quiet recollection. Only in this way does one gain access to the royal secrets, which are the happiness of the spouse. Only by this mode of living does one hold oneself respectfully face to face with truth. Retirement is the laboratory of the spirit. Interior solitude and silence are its 2 wings. All great works were prepared in the desert, including the redemption of the world. The precursors, the followers, the Master himself, all obeyed or have to obey one and the same law. Prophets, apostles, preachers, martyrs, pioneers of knowledge, inspired artists in every art, ordinary men and the man God all pay tribute to loneliness, in the life of silence to the night. In the primeval night and its solemn emptiness, the universe was shaped by the creative hand. He who desires the joy of creating must not be in a hurry to pronounce his fiat lux, nor especially to pass in all review all the animals in the world. In propitious darkness let him take time like God to prepare the material of the stars. The most exquisite songs in nature are heard at night. The nightingale, the crystal-voiced toad, the cricket sing in darkness. The cock proclaims the day and does not wait for it. All who hear a message, all poets, all seekers, also those who are in the alert to pick up the truths that lie scattered round us, must plunge deep into the vast emptiness which is the plenitude. No great man has tried to escape this law. Lacordaire said that he had made for himself in his room between his soul and God a horizon wider than the world, and had procured for himself the wings of the rest. Emerson proclaimed himself a savage. Descartes shut himself up in his heated room. Plato declared that he used more oil in his lamp than wine in his goblet. Bossuet would get up at night to find the genius of silence and inspiration. Great thoughts came to him only when he was far from the futile noises and preoccupations. Has not every poet that impression that in his verse he is but translating the mysterious revelation of silence, which, according to the formula of Gabriel de Lozoya, he hears as a voiceless hymn? The things that count must set up a barrier between him and the things that do not count. Commonplace life and the ludibria that St. Augustine spoke of, the games and the quarrels of children ending in a kiss, must cease under the kiss of the muse, under the delight-giving and tranquilizing caress of truth. Why hast thou come? St. Bernard asked himself about the cloister. Ad quid vinisti? And you, thinker, why have you come to this life outside the ordinary life, to this life of consecration, concentration, and therefore of solitude? Was it not because of a choice? Did you not prefer truth to the daily lie of a scattered life, or even to the noble but secondary preoccupations of action? That being so, will you be unfaithful to the object of your devotion by falling back into the grip of what you have freely given up? If the Spirit is to lead us into the regions of interior solitude, as he led Jesus into the desert, we must first offer him the solitude we have created. Without retirement, there is no inspiration, but within the circle of the lamplight, the stars of thought gather above us, as it were, in a firmament. When silence takes possession of you, when far from the racket of the human highway the sacred fire flames up in the stillness, when peace, which is the tranquility of order, puts order in your thoughts, feelings, and investigations, you are in the supreme disposition for learning. You can bring your materials together. You can create. You are definitely at your working point. It is not the movement to dwell on wretched trifles, to half live while time runs by, and to sell heaven for nothings. Solitude enables you to make contact with yourself, a necessity if you want to realize yourself, not to repeat like a parrot a few acquired formulas, but to be the prophet of God within you who speaks a unique language to each man. We shall come back later at length to this idea of an equipment special to each person, of a mental training, which is education, that is, the drawing out and the unfolding of a soul that is unique, that has not had nor will have its like in all the ages, for God does not repeat himself. But we must bear in mind that one can only unfold oneself in that fashion by first living with oneself closely in solitude. The author of The Imitation said thus, I have never gone amongst men without coming back less a man. Carry that idea farther and say thus, without coming back less the man I am, less myself. In the crowd, one loses one's identity, unless one keeps firm hold of oneself, and this hold must first be created. In the crowd, one has no self-knowledge, being burdened by an alien self, that of multitude. What is thy name? Legion. That would be the answer of your spirit dispersed and scattered in the life outside you. Hygienists recommend 3 things for the body, that is, the bath, the air bath, and the inward bath of pure water. I should like to add for the soul the bath of silence. In order to tone up the organism of the spirit, to accentuate the personality, and to produce the active consciousness of it, as the athlete feels his muscles and prepares their play by inner movements, which are their very life. Ravinigan said, solitude is the homeland of the strong, silence is their prayer. What a prayer indeed What a prayer indeed there is to truth, and what a power of cooperation with its influence and prolonged recollection, frequently resumed at specific times, as it were, for meeting, which will gradually become a continuous contact, a life in close community. One cannot, says St. Thomas, contemplate all the time, but he who lives only for contemplation directs everything else towards it, and resumes it when he can, gives it a sort of continuity, as far as may be on earth. Delight will be found in it, for the cell, if you stay in it, grows sweet. Cela continuata dulcesit. Now, the delight of contemplation is part of its efficacy. Pleasure, St. Thomas explains, fastens the soul to its object like a vice. It rivets attention and liberates the acquisitive faculties which sadness or boredom would constrain. When truth takes possession of you and slips her downy wing beneath your soul to lift it gently and harmoniously in upward flight, that is the moment to rise with her and to float, as long as she supports you, in the upper air. You will not thereby live in the isolation that we have commended. You will not be far from your brethren because you have left their noise behind you, the noise which separates you from them spiritually, and therefore prevents true brotherhood. For you, an intellectual, your neighbor is the person who needs the truth, as the neighbor of the Good Samaritan was the wounded man by the wayside. Before giving out truth, acquire it for yourself, and do not waste the seed for your sowing. The words of the imitation are true. If the words of the imitation are true, you will be more a man and more with men when you are far from them. In order to know humanity and to serve it, we must enter into ourselves, where all the objects we pursue are together in contact, and get from us either our strength of truth or our power of love. One can only achieve union with anything through interior liberty. To allow oneself to be possessed, to be pulled hither and thither, whether by people or by things, is to promote disunion, out of sight, near the heart. Jesus shows us, truly, that one can be entirely recollected and entirely devoted to others, entirely given to men, and living entirely in God. He preserved his solitude, that is, he touched the crowd only with a soul of silence, to which his words were like a narrow doorway for the interchanges of divine charity. What sovereign efficacy there was in that contact which reserved everything except the precise point through which God could pass and souls reach him. The fact is that there would be no place between God and the multitude except for the man God and for the man of God, the man of truth, who is ready to give. He who thinks himself united with God without being united with his brothers is a liar, says the apostle. He is but a false mystic, and, intellectually, a false thinker. But he who is united to men and to nature, without being hiddenly united to God, without being a lover of silence and solitude, is but the subject of a kingdom of death. Okay, that section, as we said, was on solitude. So, not much to add to it on my end, except to say that, look, you're going to have to spend some time alone in thought and not seek for immediate confirmation or sort of immediate affirmation, the talk of other people, or disperse yourself in the talk of other people. Most people who spend time on intellectual things realize this intuitively, in my experience, but there is a certain kind of person who spends all his time in debate in what other people say, and this person usually does not do the best intellectual work at all. He tends to dissipate himself in dispute or in chatter, and it's not the right path intellectually at all. Let's see what we have. I missed Chris. So Chris, this was about the previous thing. Chris said, do you think St. Paul's applying his trade so as to not be a burden on anyone applies to intellectuals, or is it more for the evangelists? Well, I mean, nobody should seek to be a burden on others, at all, uh, uh, especially the evangelists. Um, Now, Paul also says that it is right for the man of God to receive support from the community, but you should also seek a trade so as to burden the community as little as is necessary, within reason, and within the due support of the community. But it's the same for the intellectual. I mean, nobody, apart from necessity, should seek to be a mere dependent on others. It's not befitting your dignity. It's not befitting the dignity of the others who support you. Even if it's easy for them, which happens. You might have wealthy parents or somewhat wealthy parents, and you don't take a lot. But it's still a vice for you, and it's not in keeping with, that wealth and those opportunities that your parents give you to dissipate yourself that way. And so too with intellectuals. Shouldn't just lean on whoever will support you, and not seek to support yourself. Let's see. Okay. And there were no other questions that I saw, so we'll go on to 3, because we're getting over 3 hours, and I usually like to. Now, you could study on average, most people can't. I talked about this yesterday. Most people can't really effectively study more than 3 hours a day on average, which is not to say some days might be 4 or 5 hours, and some might be 1 or 2. But on average, 3 hours is about it. And if anybody talks to you about, 10 or 12-hour cram sessions in college back to back, that's not study. That's not real learning. That is priming short-term memory for regurgitation, or cranking out a paper to crank out a paper. But that's not real learning. That's not gonna work. I mean, you might learn something, but you'll learn stuff in the first 2 to 3 hours, or in the effective 3 hours of that 10 to 12 hours. You will not. Anything you learn in a cram session beyond, 1 to 3 hours, and usually the whole session will not be very effective. But anything you learn in the session, beyond that 1 to 5 hours of effective time, 2, 3, 4, 5 months later won't exist. It won't be retained in the memory. It won't be of any use. So do not use that as a model for learning. We're on section 3. Section 3, as we said before, is entitled Cooperation with One's Fellows. All our explanations so far show clearly that the solitude we have extolled is a value needing to be modified by related values, which complete it and turn it to account. We are not pleading for a solitude without purpose. The sacrifice of intercourse with our brethren and of their sympathy carries a compensation. The retirement to which we have a right must be a splendid isolation. Now, will it not be all the richer, all the more fruitful, if the higher contacts which we seek in retirement are furthered by consorting in wise measure with well-chosen associates? The first association of the intellectual, that which will show him for what he is, apart, of course, from his needs and his human duties, is association with his fellows. I use the word association. I should prefer to say cooperation, for to associate without cooperating is not doing intellectual work. But so it's funny because so often when you have a group of people thinking and doing, talking about intellectual things, there will arise people who want to hang out, but they don't do anything. But they think they're doing something, but this is not real. I use the word association. I should excuse me. But how rare in this age of individualism and social anarchy is such a kinship of minds. Pierre Gratry deplored it. He dreamed of a Port Royal and wanted to make of the oratory a Port Royal without the schism. What labor could be saved, he said, if people could join and help one another, if 6 or 7 together with the same idea worked by way of mutual teaching, becoming turn by turn pupil and master of the others, if by some happy concourse of circumstances they could even live together, if besides lectures in the afternoon and studying following on the lectures, they could talk in the evening at supper of all these noble things, so as to learn more by drinking them in conversation than by the very lectures. The workshops of old, especially those of the artists, were a gathering of friends, of family. The workshop of today is a jail or a union meeting. But in response to the need, which makes itself more and more felt around us, shall we not see the old camaraderie workshop revived, widened, opened up, and yet no less closely united than of yore? The time would be opportune to conceive and to found the intellectual workshop or consortium and association of workers, all equally enthusiastic and diligent, banded together frequently, living in simplicity, in equality, no one aiming at domination, even though someone might have a recognized superiority which would be of advantage to the group. Without pride or the spirit of rivalry, seeking only truth, the friends thus gathered together would, so to say, multiply one another, and their common soul would reveal a wealth of which no sufficient explanation would appear to be discoverable in any single part. One needs such a strongly tempered soul to work alone. What heroism is it that would be one's own intellectual society, one's own encouragement and support, to find in a poor isolated will the strength that might spring from the impetus of a multitude or from stern necessity? One begins with enthusiasm. Then, as some difficulty arises, the demon of laziness whispers thus, "What is the good?" Our vision of the goal grows dim. The fruit of effort is too distant or appears too bitter. We have a vague sense of being duped. It is certain that the support of others, their example, the exchange of ideas, would be admirably efficacious against this gloomy mood. They would supply the place in many people of that power of imagination and constancy of virtue which only the few possess, yet which are necessary for the persevering prosecution of great purpose. In monasteries where there is no talking, no visiting, the influence of a corridor in which each little room is the scene of assiduous work encourages and spurs on each ascetic. These apparently isolated cells form a hive. The silence is collective. The work is in fellowship. Walls are no barrier to the concord of the soul. One and the same spirit reigns over all, and in the total harmony each one's thought stands out like a motif of a symphony, supported and prolonged by the great general wave of sound. And then, when an exchange takes place, the concern grows richer. That is, each person speaks and listens, learns and teaches, takes and gives, getting something even as he gives. And perhaps this last aspect of the cooperation is the most to be envied. Friendship is an obstetric art. It draws out our richest and deepest resources. It enfolds the wings of our dreams and hidden indeterminate thoughts. It serves as a check on our judgment, tries out our new ideas, keeps up our ardor, and inflames our enthusiasm. We have examples of all that in our day in the young groups and young reviews in which men of understanding and conviction assume a task and devote themselves to an idea. The Quartiers de la Quarantaine sprang up from such a desire. The Amitié de France, the Revue des Yeons, the Revue des Yeux and the Du Saucoeur are every day more and more inspired by it. Sorry, my French is terrible, by the way. In these groups, the workers do not always live together, but they work with the same spirit. They concert their efforts. They criticize one another. They are both protected and stimulated by a setting to which an initiating idea or a great tradition gives the essential character. Try, if you can, to join some such group. Try, if need be, to establish one. In any case, even if you are materially isolated, seek out in spirit the society of the friends of the true. Join their assembly. Feel yourself in brotherhood with them and with all the seekers, all the creators that Christianity brings together. The communion of saints is not a phalanstery. Nevertheless, it is a unity. The flesh alone profiteth nothing. The spirit, even alone, can do something. The unanimity which bears fruit consists not so much in being together in one place, or belonging to a group with a label, as in this, that each one should labor with the feeling that others are also laboring, that each one in his place should concentrate on the work while others are concentrating, so that one task be accomplished, that one principle of life and activity be its guiding spirit, and that one parts of the watch, to each of which a home worker devotes his exclusive attention, be put together by God. Okay, let's see if we got any other commentary. Yeah, Patrick says he likes the part about the demon of laziness. Yeah, it's a real issue. You have to be kept up in work, and of course, you have to find ways to order your life so as to keep up in work, and you need to have others around you to keep up in work. I mean, surprise, the reason I'm doing this is communicated here. Like, I need other people around me to keep up this work. I used to read to people on a regular basis, and that helped keep up my study, and then I didn't do it so much anymore, and my study suffered. I have done very little for a year or so, and it makes a big difference. On this section, by the way, finding others. So we're in a really weird time in the history of the West. There's a lot of online stuff, and there's not a lot of in public stuff. And he has no such vision in mind of this kind of situation. I would say that, of course, some kind of online intellectual activity is fine. It's a I mean, he would have had, like, if you contribute to a journal back in the day, some kind of intellectual journal, some kind of poetic journal, something like that, whatever, or you correspond with others by letter. That's like the internet in a certain way. Not all the same, but like it. So sort of remote contact with others and things like that is fine in a certain respect. But don't it's got vices. This medium we're on right now is semi face to face. You're looking at me and you can hear me and you can hear my moods and the way I talk about things and the way I approach things, so you can get a good sense of my character. But when we're all in text, you're on Reddit or something, there's real vices that come out all the time. Or on Twitter, there's real vices, and people are not charitable and not appropriate. And so when you're having that kind of group, you need to be aware of the vices. But on the other hand, if you're going to have an intellectual life, you need to be in group with other people. It's important. And we won't have that in public gatherings like we used to in most places, unless you're in New York or some, particular cultural center. But, even on a university, it's hard to get independent. Even at a university, strangely enough, it's hard to get independent intellectual groups together. I've tried it. You get 2, 3, 4 people. And those are people at a place at least in theory, for learning, So it's, it's a difficult time for us. But, you have to do your best, and you have to start those opportunities that you need to grow yourself if you can't find them. All right, we'll go to section 4. Cultivation of necessary contacts is the title of this section. I have also said that the solitude of the thinker does not imply neglect of his duties or forgetfulness of his needs. Certain contacts are necessary. Being necessary, they are part of our life. That is, even of the life of an intellectual, since we do not separate the intellectual from the man. It is your task to link them with your intellectual life, so that not only they will not interfere with it, but they will serve it. That is always possible. The time given to duty or to real need is never lost. The care bestowed on these things is part of your vocation, and would be an obstacle to it only if you thought of your vocation in an abstract way, apart from providence. We must not think, writes Minet de Briand in his diary, that the only and best use of time consists in regular, continuous, and tranquil mental work. As often as we act rightly, conformably to our actual present position, we are making a good use of life. You will not imagine that your work is of more importance than you, and that even an increase of intellectual possibilities should prevail over the achievement of your true self. Do what you ought and must. If your human perfection requires it, the different demands it makes will find their own balance. The good is the brother of the true. It will help its brother. To be where we ought to be, to do what we ought to do, disposes us for contemplation and feeds it. It is leaving God for God, according to the saying of St. Bernard. It is painful to have to sacrifice precious hours in visits and on businesses which are themselves beneath our ideal. But since after all the course of the world is made to be compatible with virtue, we must conclude that virtue, intellectual or moral, will find in profit in these things. In certain days, it is only indirectly, by way of moral progress, that our intelligence will gain, in spite of its concessions to duty. In other circumstances, it will gain of itself directly. For do not forget that in association with others, even in ordinary everyday meetings, there is something to be gleaned. Too much solitude would impoverish you. Someone wrote recently thus: the difficulty of novel writers nowadays seems to me to be this: if they do not go into society, their books are unreadable, and if they do, they have no time to write. That is the tormenting question of wise measure which we meet everywhere. But novel writer or not, you must feel that you cannot shut yourself up entirely. Monks themselves do not do it. You must keep, in view of your work, the sense of the common soul of life. And how could you have it if, cutting yourself off from human beings, you had it in mind but a dream humanity? The man who is too isolated grows timid, abstracted, a little awed. He stumbles along amid realities like a sailor who has just come off his ship. He has lost the sense of the human lot. He seems to look on you as if you were a so-called proposition to be inserted in a syllogism or an example to be put down in a notebook. In the inexhaustible wealth of the real, too, we can find much to learn. We must move in it in a spirit of contemplation, not keep away from it. And in the real, is not man the most important thing for us? Man, the center of all things, the goal to which all things lead, the mirror of all things, inviting the thinker of every specialty to permanent comparisons. In the measure in which we choose, we must arrange to consort, as far as possible, with superior minds. The wife of an intellectual should see to that also. She should not open her house at random. Her tact should be a sort of sieve. More than the society of the great world, she should esteem that of noble spirits. To so-called clever men, she should prefer men of weight, well-informed, of firm judgment. knowing that in society a man passes the more surely for clever, the more he has killed his intelligence. Above all, she should not, through frivolity, vanity, some unimportant question of interest, take her husband among fools. And yet even fools have their place in serving us and completing our experience. Do not seek them out, they are there in plenty, but learn to utilize those that you do meet intellectually by a sort of counter test as a human being and a Christian, by practicing the virtues that intercourse with them extracts from us. Society is a book to read, even though a commonplace book. Solitude is a masterpiece, but remember the saying of Leibniz, who found no book so bad that he could not get something out of it. You do not think alone, just as you do not think with your intelligence alone. Your intelligence takes your other faculties into partnership. Your soul uses your body, your personality, its outside context. All these together make up your thinking being. Adjust its component parts to the best of your power, but turn even its weak points, such as illness, into things of value by means of some happily ingenious greatness of soul. However, in your association with others, bear yourself so that your mind and heart are always in control. Thus, if the setting is mediocre, you will be neither invaded nor contaminated by it. And if it is noble, it will but accentuate in you the effects of solitude. Your attachment to truth and to the lessons of truth that have been lavished on you. Our contacts with the outer world should be like those of the angel, who touches and remains touched unless he wills, who gives and from whom one takes nothing away because he belongs to another world. By moderation in speech, you will also attain that continuous recollection and that wise give and take which are so important to provision for you. To speak for the sake of what must be said, to express a timely feeling or a useful idea, and then to be silent, is the secret of keeping possession of yourself while giving something to others, instead of letting your own torch go out as it lights other torches. Besides, that is the way to give weight to one's words. Speech is weighty when one perceives silence beneath it, when it conceals and yet suggests a treasure behind the words, a treasure that it gives out little by little, as is fitting, without haste and frivolous excitement. Silence is the hidden content of the words that count. What makes the word of a soul is the abundance of what it does not express. Okay. Again, this is more on having to deal with other people. He's right. You're going to want to, in your life and in your intellectual life, get to know other people. Primarily other people of, intellectual weight, he says, if you have an intellectual calling. But you can apply this to other things. Serious people who could actually help you. But, and if you don't do this, if you don't bother to get to know other people, your intellectual life will be as if out of nowhere. You'll have no contact with other people. You'll be a weirdo. And that's not good. Because remember, as we talked about previously, this intellectual calling is to be lived in God through Christ, with the Spirit, for the sake of what? Of others. For the sake of others. You need to live in the world for Christ, in your intellectual calling as well as everything else. And this is going to require that you deal with people. People want to have a selfish intellectual life. They want to have a selfish all kinds of life, but especially a selfish intellectual life. And this isn't going to work. This isn't any good. But also not just weighty people who are helpful to what you're working on, but he says also fools are helpful. Why are foolish people helpful? Foolish people are helpful because it lets you know where sort of the vast majority of foolish society is, so you can speak to help them. How are you going to help foolish people who are lost if you don't know what fools think? So you have to come to know some fools. And that's okay. Not to become foolish, but to learn what fools need and to pity them, and so that you might help some of them. It shouldn't be forgotten. Okay, we're getting close to the end of the chapter. We're going to go ahead and, if there's no questions, there are not. No. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do section 5. That was entitled Safeguarding the Necessary Element of Action. What we have said of social contacts applies also with but little modification to action. The point is the same: to find the right balance between the life within and the life without, between silence and sound. The intellectual vocation, strictly considered, is the contrary of action. The contemplative life and the active life have always been contrasted as springing from contrary thoughts and aspirations. Contemplation gathers in, action gives out. The one seeks for light, the other longs to bestow its possessions on others. Strictly speaking, we must evidently resign ourselves to this division of tasks, being glad, each of us, to praise what we do not do, to love and appreciate its fruits in others, thanks to the communion of souls. But real life does not admit of such a strict separation. Duty may force us into action as a moment ago we saw it might in the society of our fellows, and the same principles will apply. Action regulated by conscience prepares conscience itself for the rules of truth, disposes it for recollection when the time comes, unites it to providence, which is also a source of truth. Thought and action have the same father. Then, even without obligation, it is always necessary for the thinker to receive a part of his time and of his heart for the active life. It is sometimes a small part, but in a wise man it is never totally absent. The monk who works with his hands or undertakes some apostolate, the greater doctor has his hospitals, the artist his exhibitions, his group, his journeys, his lectures. The writer has so many calls on him that it would be hard for him not to be drawn into some external project. That is all good. For if in this world everything has its measure, the interior life must have its measure also. This measure demands that action should have a limit and give place to solitude, because external action disturbs the soul, while silence calms it. But, carried too far, silence in its turn has a disturbing effect. When all a man's powers are intensely concentrated on his thinking, he easily loses his balance, his vision of the way. A diversion is indispensable to the life of the brain. We need the soothing effect of action. There are psychological reasons for this which I will not go into. Psychological reasons are based on and even identical with them. For the soul, as distinct from the body, would not grow tired. But the living composite grows tired of rest as well as of exertion. It demands a balance of which the center of gravity may move and vary from one man to another. A body too long motionless gets atrophied and nerveless. A soul which does the same wilts and broods. By carrying the cult of silence too far, one would reach the silence of death. There's another point of view. Intellectual life needs to feed on facts. One finds facts in books, but everyone knows that purely bookish knowledge is fragile. It suffers from the defect of the abstract. It loses contact and therefore sets before the judgment matter that is too fine spun, almost illusory. You see a captive balloon, said Emile to himself. See that the rope holding you to earth does not wear thin. St. Thomas devotes an article of the Summa to proving the need of basing oneself on the real in order to judge, because, he says, the real is the ultimate goal of judgment. Now the goal, all along the road, must light the way. Ideas are in facts. They do not live of themselves, as Plato thought. This metaphysical view has practical consequences. You, as a man of thought, must keep in touch with what is, else the mind loses its poise. What is dreaming but the thought cut off from the outer world, thought that has ceased to will? Unsubstantial dreaming is the rock of abstract thought. It must be avoided, as a cause of powerlessness and failure. Thought bases itself on facts, as the foot is planted on the ground, as the cripple leans on his crutches. The element of action we are recommending to the thinker will have the advantages of steadying his mind. It will have the further advantage of enriching it. How many experiences life offers us every day, We let them pass, but a deeper thinker gathers them up and makes his treasure of them. They will gradually fill out the framework of his thought, and his general ideas will be first tested and then illumined by living examples. The idea in us, devoid of its elements of experience, of its phantasms, is but an empty concept, which can no longer even be perceived. In the measure in which the phantasms are abundant, the thought is full and strong. Now everywhere on its path, action finds assimilable elements and so-called slices of life, which give form and shape to abstract ideas. It will even find an uncountable number of them, for the real is a sort of infinite, which no analysis, no rational estimate can exhaust. Put an artist in front of a tree. He will make endless sketches of it, without ever imagining that he has completely rendered what nature expresses. Put him before a sketch of a tree, even a tree by Claude Lorraine or Corot, where he has conscientiously copied it, if he has exhausted the model. The individual is inexpressible, said the old philosophers. The individual is the real, as opposed to the themes of the mind. By plunging through action into the real, we find new forms in the matter of our observations, as the artist at work enriches, corrects, and completes his conception. Lastly, action not only provides us with experience, but is also a teacher of energy, whose lessons have their uses for solitary. By its solicitations and its resistances, by its difficulties, reverses, successes, by the boredom and weariness it forces us to overcome, by the contradictions it unfailingly arouses, and by the fresh needs it gives rise to, it stimulates us and retempers our powers. It shakes us out of our fundamental laziness and that self-satisfied quietude, which are no less inimical to thought than to practical results. The exterior virtues will thus help the interior ones. Active investigation will serve recollection. The bee's spoil will prepare the honey. Thought, sounding turn by turn the two abysses of the real and the ideal, fortified by a disciplined will, enlightened and guided by those raisons de coeur which action incessantly involves, will be a far better tool for research, a far better arbiter of truth than pure reason perched on Porphyry's ladder. I should like to see our man of study steadily engaged in some enterprise not too burdensome, to which he would devote a definite amount of time, not carried away by it, and yet taking a real and hearty interest in results, which should be for him something more than the logs that people go sawing up to rest their heads. To act without throwing oneself into action is not the act of a man, and man cannot find real rest or instruction or training in it. Therefore, if there are not already any demands on you, look for causes that will inspire you because they are worthwhile, movements that make for light, rehabilitation, preservation, progress, leagues for the public good, societies for the defense of right and for social action. All such enterprises as demand of their man, if not his whole life, at least his whole self. Devote yourself to some such work in the moments when inspiration grants you, and even imposes on you a leave of absence that will be to her own advantage. Then you will come back to her, and the heaven she opens to you will be all the lovelier because you have made trial of the treasures, but also of the dangers, the filth, and the rugged ways of the earth. That's the end on the section. There's no questions. There's not much more to say to it than indeed find actions to take that keep yourself capable of making action. Since we're drawing on into 3.5 hours, which I don't like at all, I'll go ahead and complete the chapter with this next section. And it is a short section, thanks be to God. Section 6 is entitled Preservation of Interior Silence. It seems to me to follow from all this that silence, retirement, the solitude useful to the thinker, are realities modified by practical considerations, but inspired by a conviction of strict necessity. It is in view of retirement, silence, and inner solitude that action and outer contacts are admissible, and by them they must be regulated. It cannot be otherwise if the intellectual is truly consecrated, and if it is impossible to serve two masters. The spirit of silence must therefore pervade the whole of life. That is what matters most of all. It is said sometimes that solitude is the mother of results. Not solitude, but the state of solitude. So much so that we could, strictly speaking, conceive an intellectual life based on 2 hours work per day. But does anyone imagine that having set those 2 hours aside, one may then act as if they did not exist? That would be a grave misconception. Those 2 hours are given to concentration, but the concentration of the whole life is nonetheless necessary. An intellectual must be an intellectual all the time. What St. Paul suggests to the Christian thus, whatever you eat or drink or whatever else you do, do all in the glory of God, must apply to the Christian in search of light. For him, the true is the glory of God. He must keep it always in mind, submit to it in everything. The solitude recommended to him is not so much one of place as of recollection. It means rising above things rather than keeping away from them. It consists in an upward isolation, thanks to the surrender of self to the higher things and the avoidance of frivolity, wandering ideas, fickleness, capricious fancies. It reduces to practice the conversatio nostra in caelis of the apostle by lifting us up and our intercourse into the heavens of spirits. To stay in one's study and to indulge in the interior babble, the solicitations of desire, the exaltation of pride, the flood tide of thoughts that introduce within us an absorbing and discordant outside world. Would that be solitude? There's a false solitude as there is a false peace. On the contrary, to go out and act through duty or wisdom, or for the sake of relaxation, of which we shall later plead the necessity, may be a higher kind of solitude, which feeds and tones up the soul instead of depressing and weakening it. What St. Augustine calls the so-called purity of solitude may be maintained everywhere. What destroys its purity may soil even its abiding place. You can be in a town, wrote Plato, like a shepherd in his hut on top of a hill. Keep your inward inspiration, your reserve, the love of what you have devoted yourself to. Have the God of truth with you, and you are alone in the midst of the universe. Okay, that's the end on the chapter and the end on the reading for today. Let's see. There are no more questions, it seems. I'll make sure. I don't want to miss anybody. No, there's no more chapters for today. There's no more questions for today, it looks like. So that being said, I suppose we'll end in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us. Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us. Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. Go in peace.